I'm sorry that you have not followed the argument.
The majority of
argument we are having
is not relevant. Yes, for the majority of human history, most people we're living under.
The argument we are having at the moment is whether the lack of workers' co-ops in a modern society is evidence against your idea of workers' co-ops.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear that last part.
The argument you're having at the moment, you're completely missing the argument. The argument we're having at the moment is whether you can dismiss the lack of workers' co-ops as evidence on the grounds that workers couldn't possibly raise the capital to start their own firms. And from that standpoint, it is relevant that current consumption levels are enormously higher than people lived on in the past. And that therefore people who are really dedicated to and willing to suffer for a few years in order to get a much better system, could many of them raise the money.
All right, my name is Ben Burgess. This is Give Them an Argument. I am joined, as always, by my producer Forrest.
How's it going?
Yeah, pretty decent. Had some very uncomfortable dentistry earlier today, and the Iraq War this week is officially old enough to vote. It's not quite old enough to buy a beer. The Afghanistan is getting pretty close there.
Yeah, the Iraq War could enlist and go to Iraq at this point.
Yes, exactly. Afghanistan's been there for a while. So on Wednesday, we're going to be doing a stream, I think probably with Branko Marketic, the author of Yesterday's Man, case against Joe Biden, on that 18-year anniversary of Bush taking us to war in Iraq, and with, of course, Joe Biden's enthusiastic support. We're not going to do a Biden update in this episode because we're trying to keep a little shorter, and also because, in a way, the Iraq War stream on Wednesday kind of is our Biden update.
Yeah,
for this week.
I have a lot of Biden lead up to Iraq clips that I've been searching through. So I think extending it into like an actual longer stream is probably for the best, or else we'd just be watching half an hour of Biden clips.
Yeah, exactly. So in a few minutes, we are going to be joined by a cavalcade of guests to talk to us about Medicare for All. So the first two of those are going to be Dr. Abdul El-Sayed and Micah Johnson, who are the co-authors of this book, Medicare for All, A Citizen's Guide. The second half, going to be talking to Natalie Shure about some articles that she's written for Jacobin and The Nation about the strategy and politics around the fight for Medicare for All. Whereas in the first half, we're going to probably focus more on policy and the kind of wonky stuff. Although Abdul and Mike are very good on policy, on the strategy and politics, and Natalie is very good on the policy and wonky stuff. So I'm sure there'll be some of each.
To the point where they've interviewed each other.
Yeah.
On those topics.
Yeah, exactly. But first, I want to talk about a different subject, which is the subject of our the cold open that you just listened to, which was from my debate with David Friedman, son of Milton and Rose Friedman, and continuing in their right-wing libertarian tradition, as you can tell from the clip. And I did that last week on the Modern Debate YouTube channel. We'll replay it on the Give Them an Argument YouTube channel sometime very soon. I'm not sure exactly, but within the next several days. But I just wanted to talk about what I think that clip gives you a pretty good sense in terms of both tone and content of what that debate was like. And I just wanted to talk about that argument that he's making, because if you talk to libertarians, not just about the sort of badly necessary baby steps like Medicare for All, like what we're going to talk about in a few minutes, but about the more radical long-term goals of the socialist left, they'll tell you, look, sure, workers' control, yeah, you can have that, but that's if that's so great, right? Why don't workers just bring it about already? Just start up co-ops, and a lot of the and there are a few different ways that you could respond to that, right? There's the, what I spent, one way is by pointing out that one shouldn't have to tell libertarians that there's massive state intervention, that we live in a very far from an actually free market. And so, the idea that, you can start up a little cooperative grocery store to compete with Walmart, in where Walmart has the benefit of like squatting on land that the government probably took using eminent domain to give them to build that superstore is a little ridiculous. And what I was emphasizing in that debate, and you could kind of hear in that clip, which is that Friedman will say, oh, well, no problem. Just like for a few years, you just a bunch of people, you just maybe pool your income and, you cut your consumption in half. You have a hippie standard of living. That's how I put it, for a few years while you get the co-op up and running and then see, workers' control is so great. Now you've got it. And of course, what I was emphasizing in that interchange was that right now we live in a neoliberal hellscape where ordinary people, including many people we consider to be middle class, at least in the colloquial sense of that phrase, are financially stressed all the time, worried about paying their bills, worried about things like losing their health insurance or where their health insurance is going to come from, tied into the main subject of today's show. And so the idea that it's not a big deal to just sort of cut your, consumption in half for a few years, strikes me as a little out of touch. And that's a lot of what we end up going back and forth about. But one of the reasons I wanted to do this little callback now, and, again, people can see the whole debate sometime in the next several days when we post it on the channel. But one of the reasons that I wanted to do that callback is that there is like a germ of truth in what he's arguing, but I think it's a little misleading, and I think it's worthwhile thinking about why it's misleading. So the germ of truth is it's certainly true that there are people who make crazy sacrifices to their present day consumption to build businesses. That absolutely does happen, right? But the question is whether it's realistic to think that on a large scale, that could be a way of like building up a big worker cooperative sector of the economy without the government having to get involved, without needing social policy, to promote that. And I think that to explain why not, it's important to make a couple of distinctions. One of which has to do with one of the two distinctions is about what people's motives are, right? So is the motive for doing this what he was kind of suggesting in that clip we just watched, which was to build a better society? So is it ideological, or is it just like personal material comfort? So if it's ideological, then I think this is pretty closely equivalent to the idea that you can achieve progressive goals by voting with your dollars, that you just buy some products and you don't buy other products, and you can kind of make it work that way. And of course, a huge problem with that is that when you quote unquote vote for your dollars, I have an article in Jackman where I talk about this. You're not voting, like if you want to think, okay, so it's a referendum about how you feel about that company's policies in whatever respect. It's not just a referendum on that, right? Like you're trying to decide between two brands of breakfast cereal. Sure, maybe some of it is about how you feel about the company, maybe, right? If you're a slightly strange person, but mostly it's a referendum on, which one tastes better, which one your kids like more, and whether you're willing to them be mad at you for picking the one they like less. And most likely when you're making this decision, you're incredibly stressed out. Anyway, you've got like 10 seconds, to stand there in the aisle picking this, because you're like shopping on your way home, whatever. And so it's the idea that most people are going to prioritize those ideological things there, I think is unrealistic, that the context of politics, of electoral action, of union organizing, these are contexts that reward actually prioritizing ideological agendas, whereas the context of market decisions very much does not reward those those priorities. And I think that's even more so if you're talking about things that are going to have a massive impact on your life for the next few years. If, on the other hand, the motive is not ideological, if the motive is just trying to get a better life for yourself personally, then look, most people in that position, if that's their motive, why would they try to and they're engaged in those crazy sacrifices in a long shot effort to achieve that goal, since most businesses fail in the first 5 years anyway. Why would they start a co-op? And so they'd have to like share the fruits of that success with others. Why not just shoot for becoming a regular business owner?
Yeah. And then you can always be putting off those ideological concerns and be like, you know what, we're going to do things more ethically once we make enough money to do that. You know what I mean? Like, it's like a normal person starting a business. Like, I don't think most people have the resources to be ideological like that.
No, exactly. And again, if the motive isn't ideological, if the motive is personal, is just trying to build a better life for yourself, then you wouldn't try to do that by starting a co-op. So sure, you'd have a better life than you would as a worker in a regular business. You'd do that by trying to become a regular business owner with employees. Yeah. Clearly, that way you'd have a much better life, than you have right now. Why not shoot for the moon if you're just acting out of self-interest in a system where both possibilities are on the table? So again, I think that this is one of those things. It sounds like a reasonable argument. Maybe if you're only halfway paying attention or you're only thinking about certain things, like, okay, sure, lots of people do sacrifice to build businesses, but it makes less sense the more you think about it.
Yeah.
I want to switch gears because I know Abdul and Micah are ready to come on. You want to play the first clip before we bring them on?
Yeah.
That is the key point, right? Is that most people don't think about choices, whether or not they get to pick between X health insurance plan or Y health insurance plan with a certain level of premium or a certain level of deductible. These are words that nobody really understands because they don't make much sense anyway. And they think about choice as, what doctor can I see? What services can I get? When and where can I get those things? And unfortunately, for too many Americans, either their choice is restricted because they don't have health insurance at all, or because the health insurance corporation, whom they rely on for health insurance, tells them what doctor they can see, what services they can get, and when they can do it. And so we've, like you said, really flipped this on its head. The other conversation that tends to come up all the time, Micah, is the conversation about cost. And again, I feel like that's a misnomer, right? Because the question is always cost for whom. But we really wanted to connect that to the cost question that real people face every single day. Can you talk about how the way that we took this on in the book is shaped by and informed by your experience with your patients every day?
Yeah, so the way we put it in the book is that we ask, what does Medicare for All do to the kitchen table budget? Not just to the government budget, because that's what.
All right. So let's bring on Micah Johnson and Abdul El-Sayed, the authors of this book, Medicare for All, a Citizen's Guide. Thank you guys so much for coming on.
Hey, thank you so much for having us.
Thank you. Really excited for the conversation.
Yeah. No, this is a really good book. It's a really valuable book. It's really accessible, but rigorous and in sort of going through all of these policy details. So Micah, do you want to kind of start us off where you left off in that clip, talking about the kitchen table budget and why that's the sort of budget that's more relevant to this conversation?
Absolutely. And that's what patients are facing every day. I come at this conversation as a doctor thinking about how my patients are impacted by the costs in the system. And the fact is, we just put such a huge burden on working class and middle class people. Almost 10 million Americans are driven into poverty by medical costs every year. Hundreds of thousands of bankruptcies are caused by medical costs. So that's the kind of budget that I think we need to be thinking about when we're talking about healthcare costs. Because the critical thing is that, yes, on a national level, Medicare for All would cost similar or less than the current system. but it would make an even bigger impact for low income and middle income folks, because the current system is financed so regressively with, you know, $20,000 insurance premiums, whether you're a millionaire or whether you're a nurse. And with Medicare for All, by financing it progressively, the impact that you would have on people's monthly budgets when they sit down and try to figure out how much money they have left over for everything else would be enormous.
Yeah, so I mean, thinking back to like the Democratic primaries last year, the argument that you constantly heard from critics of Medicare for All was this thing about the costs and how you're going to pay for it, and of course, I mean, the uninteresting answer to how you're going to pay for it is with taxes, with progressive taxation, right? But do you I really want to spend a minute on why that would be so much better for most people.
Let me jump in here. The crazy thing is that we don't know how we're going to pay for it now, right? 10% of people in our country do not have health insurance because the system is so damn expensive. And so it's crazy to me that we're not asking, how do we pay for the status quo? It's like we got ourselves in this terrible financial bind. There's an obvious approach to fixing it, and we're too busy, right, asking why that's going to be better when it's clearly and obviously better, and we're struggling with what we have right now. So we spend 18% of every dollar spent on our economy in healthcare, right? That for mediocre health outcomes, life expectancy that is 6 years shorter than Japan, where they're the longest lived country in the world, 55th when it comes to infant mortality, and 10% of our population doesn't have health insurance as it stands. And so this system right now is the unaffordable one, right? Medicare for All is the affordable one. It would cost us less because of the elimination of the absurd overheads in our healthcare system. It would establish a government monopsony that would bring prices under control, and it would include every single person in the country. And so the real question is, how can we continue to afford this system where costs are too high and spiraling out of control? And why are we not leaping to establish an approach that would be far cheaper and more effective and far more equitable?
Yeah, so I want to pick up on like two or three threads of what you just said. So the first one was about so like you said, it's how we're going to pay for what we have now, and that can be true in a couple senses, right? One, and probably the one that's most important, and I think this relates to Micah's point, is how are people who currently don't have insurance going to pay for what we have now? Because clearly they can't, or at least a great many of them can't. I think something like 45% of people who don't have who are uninsured right now, say that that's because of the cost. But then the other half of that is about the costs itself. Like the costs for anybody. So as far as the first half, people, if we're paying for it by progressive taxation, obviously, not only that's fairer, and that allows people who to have it even if they couldn't buy it as a commodity, but also there's the issue of controlling costs, which you talk about in the book, and you say because this is something that I think is a sort of pseudo sophisticated objection you hear a lot to Medicare for All, and people say, there are all kinds of reasons why healthcare is so expensive in America. And, Medicare for All isn't going to just magically fix that if it's still fee for service. But something you guys talk about in the book is that under Medicare for All, the government has a lot more tools to control those costs.
It's exactly right. And I think there's a lot of misunderstanding about why healthcare costs are so much higher. And when we have the wrong diagnosis, we pick the wrong treatment. So it just turns out that healthcare costs, they're not higher because Americans are using more healthcare. Right? We're actually going to the doctor less than in other countries. We're going to the hospital less than in other countries. Our costs are higher because every time we do get care, the prices are so much higher. And that seems like a very simple thing to say. Our costs are higher because the prices are higher, but it's actually profound because it puts out of bounds so many explanations the sort of pseudoscientific explanations for why costs are higher, because so many explanations lead to the conclusion that, oh, therefore we're getting more healthcare. Like, for instance, if you blame fee for service, really what you're saying is that we're giving people too many services.
Right.
And, we can have debates around the edges for that. And there's a very good debate to be had around that, but it just comes down to the prices. And it's no mystery why, for instance, Medicare today gets prices that are a 30% discount on private insurance. It's negotiating power. Having a big federal program can set the prices, you simply bring the cost down.
Yeah. So, and I like your point about, the fee for service argument, because, this is something like, this is like the premise of the Cadillac tax from the ACA, that the problem is, that like, people are just gonna, people love going to the hospital so much, they're going to do it all the time, unless we financially disincentivize them from doing it. Which doesn't actually seem to be, like that doesn't seem to be the problem. Like like you say, around the edges, okay, right? But for the most part, that doesn't seem to be the problem. Certainly, that doesn't seem to be most people's problem.
That's right. I mean, the hard part is that I think sometimes healthcare experts are conditioned to be so myopic about what's possible because they ignore what they think is politically infeasible. And so long as they can ignore what they continue to think is politically infeasible, they will continue to focus on myopic solutions that beat around the bush rather than take on the big issue. And the other part of that is that there is a feedback loop that happens when experts don't talk about the obvious set of solutions. They don't look like solutions. And so part of what we want to do with this book was break that down a little bit, right? We want to kind of take a big gong to the question and say, hey, there's an obvious set of solutions that actually addresses the central core rot in the middle of our healthcare system. And the fact that we've been ignoring that for these technocratic fixes as if they're going to actually solve the fundamental problem where we have a major non-essential industry profiteering at the core of our healthcare system to the exclusion of the poorest people in the country. Right? The idea that these technocratic fixes are going to take on that moral problem is itself absurd, and we have to address that. And look, I think it's really important for us to be thinking about whether or not fee for service is the best model, et cetera, but within the bounds of a system that actually works, rather than assuming that our myopic answers to myopic problems are the grand answer, which they're absolutely not.
Yeah, and I like your moral clarity about that. That about the sort of central, obvious problem with the obscenity of treating something that's a important human need. That people like have to have. That you will in many circumstances, you will literally die if you consume something as private commodity. But also, I have to say, like, one thing that I do like about the book is that it does get into the weeds with what's wrong with a lot of those technocratic fixes, which I think is probably one of the things about it that's most valuable for people, certainly in the audience for this show, who overwhelmingly already have this sort of moral case that, yes, of course we should have Medicare for all, but might not know how to counter some of these things or sort of explain what's wrong, with some of these ideas that are brought up by people who say, oh, you don't need Medicare for all. We can just build on the ACA. We can just do some, wonky fix to bring down costs, and that'll be fine. And I think it's a really good resource for explaining why why none of that would address all of the problems, that are caused by the existence of this like parasitic, middleman, industry. But I do want to start with the thing that I think cuts closest to like that core moral argument, which is the stuff that you talk about at the very beginning of the book about why, like, even in purely economic terms, even if you think, okay, there are like some things that markets are an efficient way of distributing, that we can have, that it's good, that like it makes sense that like whatever, I don't know, toothpaste, is a market, like a market good is something that that it's that the best way to get people what they want from brands of toothpaste, is to go to the grocery store and make consumer choices. But at the beginning of the book, you guys break down like a bunch of like really straightforward disanalogies, like ways that health insurance and healthcare are just not like toothpaste or other market goods.
Yeah, and it's kind of stepping back. It's, to me, almost more remarkable that so many of us have been trained to think of healthcare like a market good, because it's such of jamming a square peg into a round hole that when you think about it, it's kind of crazy that we thought this could work like any other commodity in the first place. And one of the stories we tell is of a young woman, Lisa Cardillo, who has chest pain, ends up having a heart attack in her mid-30s. And if you think about just every step of the way about, one, what kind of care does she need? Well, that's part of why you go to the doctor. You don't know what kind of care that you need. And then where should you get care? Well, you have to get care quickly, and there's only so many places around. And then you get into the hospital. And then you don't know how much stuff costs because no one tells you how much it costs. And then the insurance company is paying most of it anywhere on the back end. It's not you. So there are so many obvious ways where this breaks down. And then there's also really good research on it. Even if you take kind of the crystallized case, where we cite a study where the closest thing to a commodity in healthcare would be something like MRI of your leg, like an elective MRI of your leg. The quality doesn't change very much. It's relatively abundant. It just turns out that when you do give people that price information and kind of ask them to be consumers of lower limb MRIs, and you give them some skin in the game with the deductible to make them pay for it, people just aren't shopping around for healthcare in the same way that they are for other services. In the study, the average patient would drive by 6 lower priced MRIs before they got to the one that they actually got. And that's in sort of the idealized case of something that might be treated like a market commodity. And then what I see a lot of on the health policy expert side is people think that, okay, if you can just change one part of it, like there's some excitement now around price transparency. So instead of the patient that we tell the story, Lisa, of getting a heart pump while she's in cardiogenic shock in the ICU, if you say, well, we're going to tell her what the price is beforehand, it just turns out that I think that's misguided. There are so many failures that by trying to nibble around the edges, you're not going to make healthcare into toothpaste. You just can't do it.
Yeah, like so and even in those examples, like those are like when you're thinking about whether like individual procedures, could be treated like toothpaste, and have that like just market forces could act the way that they're supposed to, when it comes to something like toothpaste. There are all of these disanalogies, that you don't show up to the hospital the way that you show up to the grocery store knowing what you want to get. You're being told what you want to get. If it's like the old thing about the commercials that end with, ask your doctor such and such is right for you. It's like, wait a second, am I telling my doctor what's prescribed for me? That seems weird, right? Like, like that seems, is he a doctor or a drug dealer, right? I'm not requesting what I want him to give to me, right? I'm hoping that, he or she or they will tell me, what I actually need. And it's often happening in emergency decisions where it's very hard to, you're not going to window shop, hospitals, when you need something to happen in the next, hour, to save your life. But even when, and maybe even especially in a different way with health insurance, it's very weird to think of it as something that could work as a market good, because, which is the premise of like, ACA marketplaces that, that we're going to window shop for health insurance. But certainly, I think the overwhelming majority of normal people are not going to, when they're reading descriptions on a website of health insurance plans, the differences between them are just going to be completely baffling to them, or certainly that's always been my experience.
Ben, let me say a couple things about that. Right, the first is that my wife and I are both doctors, and I'd say I understand health insurance pretty well. And the last time we had to choose between plans, like we full on thought about pulling out an actuarial table to figure out what the probability was as a 36 and a 34-year-old that we were going to have a really catastrophic health issue, and or she was going to get pregnant, which would have been our biggest cost. And so in order for the median person who likely doesn't have the same kind of training or expertise in healthcare to try and differentiate between these various plans that involve different levels of government bureaucracy and different juxtapositions of different costs that you may or may not have to pay at some point in time is kind of absurd. I don't think that's the choice that most people want. Most people want the choice in doctor. And the number one gatekeeper of your choice in doctor is the health insurance industry. The second point is this, Ben, look, if I were to come to you and say, hey, Ben Burgess, I've got 5 MRIs for $500. They're non-transferable. Would you like to buy them? You probably say no, because you don't need MRI, right? But here's the thing. Let's say you went out, decided to play soccer or basketball with some friends. You twisted your knee and felt a pop. And I came back to you. I said, Ben Burgess, you didn't buy those MRIs. I'm selling you one for $5,000. Would you like it? If you had the money, you probably say yes. Why? Because an MRI is critical for you to figure out what's wrong with your knee and getting back to health. The point here is that we don't actually want health care. It's not a consumer good. It's not something anybody just wants. Health care is a means to getting back to what we actually want, which is health after we lose it. And you realize 2 things here. Number one, health care is inelastic in the moment of need. And so it creates these really serious problems of power around when and how you charge people for healthcare if you're trying to make money off of it. The second is that it creates a major disincentive to preventing you from getting sick in the first place, which is, of course, what everybody wants, because you only make money in the system after people get sick. And so it's critical for folks to understand that and to appreciate that healthcare is not a consumer good. It should not be treated as one. And we have a moral responsibility to answer the public good of healthcare for people if and when they need it. The last point I'll make is this, right? Your body, my body, Micah's body, Natalie's body, who you come on is coming on after, all of our bodies are worth the same, right? We believe that in our society. We believe that it should be a good, that everybody's body should be treated the same way if it gets sick, right? I mean, the adverse of this, it'd be a crazy system if we had a legal code that punished people differently for murder depending upon the net worth of those individuals, right? And what we're getting at here is that there's something inviolable that is existentially important about a body to a human being. But in our healthcare system, we treat your body differently, right? We literally reimburse for the same care differently depending upon how much money you have. That's a crazy thing. And it doesn't meet our moral criterion.
Yeah, I mean, I really like the murder analogy. That you imagine reporting, filing a police report for a serious crime, and having it be officially above board that it would what sort of investigation you got, how seriously it was treated, depended on whether you had the bronze police plan, the platinum one, the gold one, like that would be just morally offensive on the face of it, but that's literally how the existing health insurance system works.
That's exactly right. And it is that level of moral failure that's baked into our system that we also conveniently ignore, right? And it's frustrating because people deserve better, and it's been this way for too long in this country, and people are suffering on the back end of it.
Yeah, and I want to get in just a few minutes a little bit more into like the politics of this, and into why we don't have it, why this is such a like hard fight, and what that fight looks like coming up ahead. But first, I did want to get into a couple of the sort of proposed technocratic fixes that people put out there as alternatives to Medicare for all, and what you guys say in your book about why why they don't make sense, or why they at least aren't actually alternative paths to the same goal, because that's what people will say. Look, I want the same thing that you guys want. I want universal care or whatever. We're just arguing about what the best way is to get there. But actually, a lot of these things just don't like straightforwardly don't and couldn't achieve a lot of the same goods that Medicare for All would. So one of the technocratic fixes that you guys talk about in the book is the idea that what we should really focus on are these kind of fixes that would bring down costs while keeping it, while maintaining the existence of the private health insurance industry, while keeping this as a market commodity. So, for example, some policy experts will say, "Oh, we can do things like." We can give insurance companies tools to bargain down the price from hospitals, like making it easier to exclude, more expensive hospitals that charge higher prices from insurance networks, or we can make it harder to consolidate hospitals, and so hospital systems, which, if they're consolidated, that makes it easier to jack up the price. And I thought that was one of the most interesting things in the book, where you're talking about the reasons why none of this would actually achieve the same goods as Medicare for All. And in fact, these things would make some aspects of the current system even worse, or some of them would.
So here's how I think about that suite of proposals. I think almost everyone in healthcare agrees that current healthcare markets are broken. And I think there is some debate about whether they could be fixed. And I think there are a number of proposals in the category that say, yes, our current healthcare markets don't work, but if we did X, they would work better. And, some of them, in my view, would have some small positive benefit. Like, for instance, the fact that we've allowed our hospital systems to essentially become local monopolies and oligopolies all over the country, where folks just have, in most cases, one or two big hospital systems that buy up all the other hospitals into these giant networks and then jack up prices. So yes, it would probably bring down prices, who knows, but by some number of percentage points, by doing better antitrust against hospitals. And I think there are good political reasons to do that, because concentrated economic power means concentrated political power. Right. And I think that's a problem too. But when you really just step back and you think about the size of our problems, the fact that 30 million people are uninsured, the fact that we have an entirely regressive payment system where the poorest Americans are paying a third of their income for healthcare, you can't just shave one part of healthcare costs by a couple percent and think you're moving forward. And then the point that you're getting at is that there are also ways why making healthcare work more like a market could be bad for patients, like making it easier to exclude hospitals, exclude doctors, exclude drugs from insurance plans. That would make things, in theory, more market-like negotiations, because then the insurance company it's easier for them to say no to the drug company or say no to the hospital. The problem is then you just make plans skimpier and skimpier and skimpier for patients. So I think what this tells me is that we're either making things a little bit better in terms of cost or making things noticeably worse for patients. And I think it would be a mistake to kind of hang our hats on this as the way to go for health reform.
Yeah, and one specific point that you made about the way that it makes it skimpier for patients was that one of the things that's been suggested to like technocratically like fiddle with the system to make it more market-like and bring down costs is making it easier to exclude things from networks. But the second I got to that, I thought, oh my God, that's awful, right? Because one of the if you're a person who has insurance, right? You're not among the millions, who are uninsured, and you have insurance that you can afford to use, which doesn't go without saying, and you don't, you're not being, bankrupted by it, etc. Like, one of the worst things about, having, private, usually employer-based, health insurance, is that you have to constantly worry about what's in network and what's not. So you have so for example, if you're in a, like if you're far from home and you have an emergency medical need, then there's a worry. Oh, is the hospital where I go to going to be a network? And am I going to get a big bill? And even just in the sort of most mundane kind of healthcare needs, like if you just have long-term prescriptions that you have to go see a doctor once every few months purely just to get the prescription refilled. That's it. It's routine. It shouldn't be dramatic. One of the worst things about this system is that every time you change jobs, every time your employer decides to change your insurance, then you have to find a new person who can prescribe this thing for you, who is in network. You have to do a little research to find out who that person is. You have to wait for that initial appointment. You have to wait while you're counting out the pills, and having it be even more limited. What's in network, is the kind of thing that I understand how somebody could get there if all they're thinking about is, okay, what are possible ways to tinker with the system that would have the effect of bringing down costs if this is we basically still have a market system. But if you're thinking about the actual experience of patients, I mean, that's kind of horrifying.
That's right.
Go ahead, Micah.
I say it goes back to the clip you played at the top of the show about choice. And you think about it, who has more choice? Who is more free in their healthcare choices? Is it someone in the employer-based insurance market, or is it someone on Medicare? Where if you believe the political discourse, the person on the private insurance market has all the choice in the world. They can choose Aetna, they can choose Blue Cross, they can choose United, all these beautiful choices. But the whole premise of the private insurance market, one of the things that makes it a market, is that each of these insurance companies decides what's in and what's out, which hospitals are in, which hospitals are out. That's how they negotiate. So any person on those private insurance plans has their choices restricted in very real ways. Whereas on Medicare, Medicare Advantage and sort of privatized Medicare aside, someone on Medicare, you might say, oh, well, they don't have any choice in their health insurance. But what they do have is a plan where all doctors and hospitals are in network. And I think in a very straightforward way, people on Medicare have far more healthcare choices and have more freedom in their healthcare. And I think that's one of the ways in which our political conversation gets things backwards. And I think it's no coincidence why that's the case, where it's the insurance companies want you to believe that you have less choice on Medicare, even as they're the ones who are restricting the choice of healthcare that patients can actually get.
Yeah, Abdul, you were going to say?
Yeah, no, I was gonna add, the hard part about most bureaucracies is that they're designed by bureaucrats, and bureaucrats usually make things easier for them and not necessarily easier for users. And so, we've got this broken system, and bureaucrats inside of it are like, oh, here are some things that we could do to theoretically fix the following set of problems, but they miss the entire user experience of the system. And in doing that, right, you end up forgetting the most important part, which is the user at the center. And so healthcare has become more and more complex, harder and harder to use, and more of a challenge for people who are already being chewed up and spit out by the system. I also think Ben, you just came back right in time, man.
Yeah. So sorry, I don't want to make you repeat yourself too much, but you said bureaucrats generally design things to make it easier for them.
Yeah, they design it around themselves and their own experience of the system rather than around the people who use it every day. And the problem is that a lot of times when you decide that you are going to ignore the moral rot at the center of the system, you end up designing more and more fixes that make the thing more and more complex and harder to use for the end user.
Yeah, right. Which, because that's like it's almost like the was it the old lady who swallowed the fly, right? You have you have a fundamentally like broken and system that just isn't going to get what most human beings want out of it, and you introduce a complexity to solve one problem, and you end up with, because you've maintained that rod at the core of the system, that complexity that you've introduced to solve one problem is going to lead to others elsewhere. That unfortunately makes a lot of sense.
And then you swallow a horse and die. So.
Right, exactly. Yes. And yeah, I think the point that I've heard both of you make a couple times here about choice is really important and worth circling and underlining. And this is another one of those things that I think might sound like it makes sense if you squint a little bit, but makes much less sense if you start to think about it more and relate it to any ordinary human experience, because there are lots of people who like their doctors and would be sad if they never saw their doctor again. I've never met anybody who cared passionately and deeply or had an emotional attachment to whether they had Aetna or Blue Cross Blue Shield.
That's right.
All right. So I want to bring Forrest back on. There are a couple clips that we wanted to get you guys' reaction to sort of thinking through some of like the standard arguments that that people make against Medicare for all.
Yeah, well, I was going to start with the pandemic one, but maybe since you guys are talking about choice, we should start with the debate. It's like just a supercut of different times of the debates that candidates used choice as a as a way to discredit.
Yeah, let's start there, then go to the pandemic.
All right.
The thing that Bernie's plan does is that you either have to have his plan or no plan, period, nothing. You cannot choose. A lot of these people have gone out and they've negotiated with their employers a significant health care plan that they've given up salaries for. They've given up part of their income for, and they like it. They should be entitled to choose to keep it if they wish. If they don't wish to keep it, they can buy into the public option that I propose. And it's affordable, and it can happen immediately. The attitude that we know better than ordinary people what's in their interest. I know more than you. Let me tell you what to do. And it wasn't she's elitist. The attitude is elitist, that people can't make up their own minds. You like your health insurance, but you shouldn't like your health insurance. You should have to give that up. I'm going to demand you not have that. We're going to give you something better. I know what I want.
What about choice? Well, under their plan, you will be forced to give up your private health insurance, whether you want it or not. On my plan, we trust you to make the choice that's best for your family. And that's why their plan is called Medicare for All, and my plan is Medicare for all who want it.
Our plan says that if you're uninsured, we enroll you in Medicare. If you're insufficiently insured, you can't afford your premiums, we enroll you in Medicare. But if you're a member of a union that negotiated for a health care plan that you like because it works for you and your family, you're able to keep it. We preserve choice by making sure that everybody has health care.
Time is up. Well, I've been on the Medicare for All bill since 2007, but like anything, I think we need to take steps in direction. I personally don't believe we need to take people off of their private health insurance. If they enjoy it, we need to make sure there are protections there for them around pre-existing conditions and all of that.
I can't speak for them, but what I do know is that there are millions of Americans who don't want to give up their private health insurance. Someone on my team has a father who's retired from GM 30 years, and he said that he doesn't want anybody touching his health insurance. He said that he gave up so many things in terms of salary and negotiations so that he could have his private health insurance for the remainder of his life. And I think that speaks to the sentiment of so many people.
So one thing very important. We have 180 million people out there that have great private health care, far more than we're talking about with Obamacare. Joe Biden is going to terminate all of those policies. These are people that love their health care, people that have been successful, middle-income people, been successful. They have 180 million plans, 180 million people, families, under what he wants to do, which will basically be socialized medicine. He won't even have a choice.
So, thoughts about that that montage of arguments?
You know, in the end, people don't really want a choice of a plan; they want a choice of a doctor. And Medicare for All more than lets you keep your doctor. In fact, it lets you expand which doctor you want to see, because all of the doctors would take Medicare. And so I think we're confusing what choice means in this situation, and we're allowing the health insurance talking points to dictate our public policy rather than allowing reason and allowing what's actually right for folks, and the fact that we could include every single American under the umbrella of healthcare if we were to engage in Medicare for All. So I just think that that unfortunately it's sad to see, but you know, when an industry spends billions of dollars disinforming the American public, oftentimes they can sway the talking points of politicians too.
Yeah, and this part of that also came up a few times, where there was this sort of weird attempt by different politicians in those clips to say that because workers have often fought through their unions, you know, for health insurance plans, and they've given up other things for that, therefore it's like somehow anti-labor to want everybody to have health insurance that's not tied to their employer.
Yeah, well, there's the one that's especially bad, which is Atlanta's mayor acting as Biden's surrogate, saying, you know, like an older member of her staff or someone has a father that doesn't want anyone to touch his health insurance, which would make sense if you're putting it in the framing of like, oh, you're going to lose your health insurance. You know what I mean? Like, of course, that instability scares people if that's the talking point that you're leading with is like, you're not going to know what happens. You have health insurance now and you're going to lose it. But like, that's obviously ridiculous framing.
Yeah, we've all got this kind of Pavlovian reaction to hearing that phrase, lose health insurance, you know, because what we associate with that is like not being able to go to the doctor or having huge bills. But obviously that's not what we're talking about. We're not talking about losing your health insurance. We're talking about having, public health insurance. And that's actually, so I would be really interested in you guys' take on that argument that because people have had to fight for insurance plans, and given things up in negotiations for insurance, that therefore having better insurance, you know, is like some sort of insult to that fight, or is somehow taking something away from them.
I think there's actually an interesting philosophical assumption that's in there, which is this idea of, in virtue of what do we deserve healthcare? And I think one of the ideas that's put in there is that you have to have had sacrificed something. You had to give something up to get healthcare. And I think we see that on the other side too, with the debate about Medicaid work requirements, which is that in order to deserve healthcare, you have to, document all of this things that you're trying to do. And I think that's, in some of the clips that we've seen are kind of playing into that. What did you give up to get this healthcare? And I think part of what makes the Medicare for All conversation exciting and also difficult is it asks us to rethink that. It is not because of something you did that you deserve or don't deserve healthcare. You deserve healthcare because you're a human being. We're trying to make healthcare a human right. And I think because of the way that we've been talking about healthcare for the last 40 years, it's a big shift. But I do think it is a shift that people are ready for. I think lots of people, when they really step back and think about it, really do believe that healthcare is a human right. And we see that in the polling bears out that impression. But I do think that it requires a pretty fundamental change in the way that we talk about healthcare.
Yeah, I mean, so there are two things there. One is, okay, who should have healthcare? What, if anything, should you have to do to like earn that? And yes, there's like a really compelling, just straightforward moral case for saying that you should just, being a person, should be enough, to get healthcare. If somebody, if you walk by somebody and they're drowning in a pool, what should they have to do to deserve you wading in to pull them out? Presumably nothing, right? Just be a person. But then the other half of it is, even from the labor vantage point, I mean, as somebody who in a very small way has been in this circumstance, when I was a adjunct instructor at Rutgers, I was on the board of our union local, and we didn't have health insurance, and we were trying to get it. Like when I hear that, people have had to fight for this. They've had to give up other things, wages and other things in exchange for it. I would think that the obvious response would be, okay, great. So if that's off the table now, because we're going to have Medicare for all, then now you can go back and fight for those other things that you had to give up before.
That's exactly right. Right? Is that we assume, right, that on net, if someone were to lose their employer-sponsored health insurance, then they'd be losing a benefit that their employer would be giving them. The crazy thing, though, is that employers would rather be giving you cash money, and that's the trade-off. And one of the most stark examples of this, I was talking to a small business owner who employs people in both Canada and the United States, and he was having a conversation with the folks in the United States, and he was telling them, look, I wish I could be paying you this money in cash, but instead I have to give it to some large health insurance corporation so that you have health care. For my Canadian employees, I just pay a small tax and then pay them cash in the difference. And they're getting a far better deal out of it. And so we forget the fact that those dollars aren't just yes or no dollars. They're dollars that are spent in healthcare or in something else. And that bargaining, that hard work that unions do for their members, that would be hard work that would be delivering some other benefit that they could leverage to invest in their kids, in their families. And that's the trade-off. So, it is a misnomer to frame the issue that way. And it's done on purpose to make you think you're losing something rather than in fact gaining something. And with that, a tremendous amount of freedom. Because, of course, if you're getting your health insurance through your job, makes leaving that job a lot harder to do. And it forces you to think twice. How many people are left in marriages or left in jobs that are dead ends, aren't investing in, writing that book or opening that business because they're stuck in that job so that they can get health insurance for themselves and their families. And we forget the kind of liberty, economic liberty that comes with a system that's with you, whether you turn 26, whether you get married, you get divorced, you get a new job, you turn 65, it's always there for you.
It's also like driving a really sinister wedge between universal programs and unionized workers. And I think that this happens all the time. Like we were just talking about the just transition, the idea that, like when we get a Green New Deal, like workers have to be transitioned from one industry to jobs kind of in the same industry that, that would be environmentally friendly jobs. And it's kind of the same thing here, like driving a wedge between unionized workers and the idea of universal health care.
Which again is particularly, for the reason Abdul was saying, is particularly weird in this case because you're literally not, there's no trade-off between values here. You're literally not, giving something up. It, maybe used to be the case that you had to accept slightly lower wages or whatever because your priority in bargaining, was making sure that everybody had health care. Now you'd have the health care anyway. So you no longer have to accept those lower wages or whatever. You can go back to the bargaining table and fight for higher wages or for other kinds of benefits because this other thing that you were willing to sacrifice that stuff for, you have anyway. And also, I think Abdul's point about freedom is really important here because. Also, if we're going to talk about the labor connection, think about the other half of it. Think about people who are in non-unionized workplaces but might like to organize a union. That's legally you're not supposed to be able to fire people for that, but people are fired for that all the time. There are real risks there. There are ways that you can be fired for that. And it's disguised as something else. And people are somewhat more likely to be willing to take risks and taking on their employers if they have fewer of these strings tying them to those employers, like, oh crap, if I lose this job, I'll lose my health insurance. All right. So everything we've been talking about so far, is a conversation that we could have equally had in 2019. But of course, as the fact that we're not having this conversation in a studio somewhere. There's a specific thing that's that's going on in the world that puts all this in an even different light. So, Forrest, do you want to play the clip about healthcare in the pandemic?
Yeah,
you have that one.
President Biden, some medical experts are saying the only true way to control this virus is through a national quarantine, requiring every American other than essential personnel to stay home. Would you take that unprecedented step of a national lockdown?
What I would do is what we did in our administration. I would call a meeting in the Situation Room of all the experts in America dealing with this crisis. I would sit them down and I would do exactly what we did then. What is it that we need? Listen to the experts. What do we need? And with all due respect to Medicare for all, you have a single payer system in Italy. It doesn't work there. It has nothing to do with Medicare for all. That would not solve the problem at all. We can take care of that right now by making sure that no one has to pay for treatment, period, because of the crisis. No one has to pay for whatever drugs are needed, period, because of the crisis. No one has to pay for hospitalization because of the crisis, period. That is a national emergency, and that's how it's handled. It is not.
All right. So I know, I'm not sure about Micah. I know Abdul has to jet soon. But first, I wanted to make sure that I gave you guys a chance to react to that clip, right? Like, is it the case that simply because of the government covering, things that are immediately related to the coronavirus, that we are not in fact at a disadvantage, in the pandemic because we don't have Medicare for all?
15 million people lost their health insurance because of our employer-sponsored health system. And even if they get back on, that interruption can be devastating for people. Not only that, but because everything is predicated on a profit, we watched as our doctors and nurses and hospital workers went without the basic PPE they needed because, of course, management consultants will tell you that you shouldn't stock more of those things than you absolutely need. On top of that, we watched as our hospitals were battling bankruptcy. 47 of them went into bankruptcy in the middle of a pandemic. And meanwhile, you know who's making bumper profits? The health insurance industry. Why? Because they don't have to pay for those elective procedures that they had booked, and they just kept that as profit and instead plowed a lot of that money back in, $151 million to be exact, into 845 lobbyists who now have pushed forward a system. And look, I love a lot of things about the American Rescue Plan. The one part I don't love is the fact that instead of putting people on a public option or on Medicare who lost their private health insurance, we are plowing money back into the private insurance industry through a set of COBRA subsidies that basically pays them to do the thing they could have afforded and should have done in the first place, which is keep people on their health insurance, even if they had lost it in the midst of a global pandemic. One of the most intense disasters that we had seen in this country, especially in the first 3 months, right? An unprecedented moment. Instead of keeping those folks on their health insurance, they just made bumper profits and then plowed that back into lobbying. And so there are a lot of things that we got wrong. The last one I want to talk about is the fact that we are in a moment where we are trying to deploy a vaccine, which is a medical marvel, which, by the way, the R&D was largely paid for by the American public, and the pharmaceutical industry is trying to take all the credit for it. But in effect, we still can't figure out how to deploy it at scale, right? Only about 12%, 13% now of Americans have gotten their full course of vaccinations because we don't have a functioning public health infrastructure. And that's largely because we spend 18% on all the curative stuff. And so in our system, right, because you can't make money preventing disease, we don't do it. And we are paying we're paying the consequence of that now. And so there are a lot of things that would have been very different under Medicare for all. We would have been able to make sure that our hospitals were well supplied. They wouldn't have had to worry about bankruptcy. 15 million of people wouldn't have lost their health insurance. And we would have done the work of investing in prevention in the first place. Because, of course, if the government is your insurer yesterday, today, and tomorrow, their investment yesterday into your health bears out for them tomorrow. And so there's a real incentive to do that. Under private health insurance, there's not. So for all of those reasons, Medicare for all certainly would have prepped us far better for this kind of crisis than what we saw over the past year plus.
All right. I'm going to let you go in a second, but I did, since you mentioned something that I think is really important that I think a lot of people don't know, which is about the R&D to develop the vaccines. Do you want to expand on that really quickly?
$10 billion, right? Excuse me, $100 billion is what was spent in Operation Warp Speed, and that is largely what both invested in the baseline R&D for these vaccines, and also guaranteed purchase for vaccines that were manufactured. In fact, guaranteed contracts even if the research failed. And on top of that, a lot of the basic science was based on government investment. That company Moderna, right? It was a company that was seeded by government grants to figure out how to create an RNA based vaccine that is what we are, thankfully deploying today in the form of both the Pfizer vaccine and the Moderna vaccines. And so much of the basic research that we are now watching as the pharmaceutical industry is deploying, right, came out of government funds. And we have to be serious about who funds the vast majority of the riskiest research before it ultimately bears out. And we have this sort of system of public-private partnerships where the public puts in all the money and the private corporations get all the shine. And that's part of the problem here.
Yeah, fair enough. Thank you. Thank you so much.
I just want to say that I appreciate that all three of you guys have bookshelves with your books featured on it. It makes me wish I had written a book so I could have that.
You got an amazing mountain scene over here. Yours is far more.
Well, I put my book behind the tree actually, and I thought it was.
It's a whole mountain of your books. I mean, we
It's future books. I mean,
yeah. There we go. There we go. Everybody should check out this book, which. Unlike the one behind me, I didn't write. These guys did. Medicare for All, a citizen's guide. I think even people who are, familiar with like a lot of the basics of this debate, have, can kind of explain why, it would be, Medicare for All would save most people money and, things like this. I think you're going to learn things from this. I think that if you run into the most sophisticated objections to Medicare for All, this book is really going to give you ammunition. So, you shouldn't have to buy health insurance, but do buy this book.
Thanks so much for having us.
All right. Thanks, guys. Bye.
Thank you.
All right, that was Dr. Abdul El-Sayed and Micah Johnson, authors of Medicare for All, a citizen's guide. In just a minute, we are going to be joined by Natalie Shure to talk a little bit more about the politics and strategy, those dimensions of the fight for Medicare for All. So before we do that, let's just plug a few things that are coming up. So one of them I already mentioned on Wednesday. Forrest and I think Branko Marketic are going to be doing a stream on the 18th anniversary of the beginning of the war in Iraq, and again, that's why we're not doing a Biden update right now. That essentially is going to be our Biden update, given his role in all of that. And on Friday, got the next Philosophy Friday stream with Jennifer Burgess. On Sunday, JG Michael from the Parallax Views podcast is going to be joining me for the Sunday night debate breakdown. We're going to be watching this is a real thing that really happened. Timothy Leary's 1990 debate with G. Gordon Liddy. So
that's insane. Like hearing that's the thing that happened is like it's like playing Mad Libs or something. I don't know.
yeah, exactly. And next Monday, RJ Esco is going to be on to talk with me about this book, Why Not Socialism, by G.A. Cohen. And Nanda Vila is going to be on, which should be a lot of fun. Also, want to just briefly talk about. I missed in that rendition of all the things that are coming up. I missed on Thursday the episode that's going to be dropping for patrons. We'll play the preview probably a little bit later in the episode. But the Thursday episode for patrons is Jean Bajalan and Pascal Robert joining me to do a Chapo reading series style line by line breakdown of an article that was printed in the National Review defending the British monarchy.
Yeah, that episode was really good. I mean, obviously people should become patrons for a lot of reasons, but becoming a patron this week, I think hearing Pascal go against the monarchy is great.
Yeah. Well, there's a line. I don't remember where he says it, but there's a line from Christopher Hitchens, old good pre 9/11 Hitch, obviously, that I've always liked, where he's talking about how it's such a damn shame that people, that Americans who are called Anglophiles, always admire reactionary garbage like the monarchy and the English equivalent, for Americans, they're always like really into, American imperialism. It's never that the people who are the English, Americophiles, are big fans of the separation of church and state, and the American Anglophiles are big admirers of the National Health Service.
Yeah, that's good. I don't know. It's just kind of. I mean, after watching kind of that like Jordan Peterson hierarchy thing, it kind of makes sense why American conservatives are so obsessed with the monarchy a lot of times, because it literally is like a pointless hierarchy, like literally a pointless hierarchy that they believe in Britain is God-given pretty much. And that, what I mean?
Yeah. I mean, people say, oh, they don't really govern and, that's just symbolic. It's like, yeah, it is just symbolic, but what it symbolizes is profound inequality.
Yeah.
In any case, we are now joined to continue the health discussion by Natalie Shure. Thank you so much for coming on, Natalie.
Hey, thank you so much for having me.
So I wanted to kind of switch, unless you have anything to say about the monarchy, I want to switch gears to talking, a little bit more about the political and strategic aspects of the Medicare for All fight, since this is something that you've written a lot about, and so that's the article that you wrote recently for the Nation, but also you've written a couple things for Jacobin recently about sort of what the road ahead for fighting for Medicare for all, looks like, and I want to get to the Nation piece, but first I want to talk about a little bit more of that, that big picture stuff. So I think a lot of people, like that moment when it seemed like Bernie Sanders might, get the Democratic presidential nomination, become president, was the time when Medicare for all has felt the most achievable. And so, of course, now, that none of that happened, it feels, it feels much, much less so. But what do you think, like realistically, like just big, 1,000 feet, kind of view, right? Like what does the path from where we are now to actually achieving this look like?
Right. So I think overall, the promise of the Bernie Sanders presidency, as far as I saw it, was that Bernie Sanders understood power. He understood that the way out of this neoliberal era and its very long tail is to build power from the ground up, build worker power, build movement power, and that those are the things that are going to allow you to, challenge and change the constraints that we're working within. So, what that means is, having a top-down champion of movements, I think probably the most pro-labor president in history, et cetera, would have gone a long way to helping those movements grow and helping build that sort of confrontational grassroots energy. But just having him in office wouldn't have necessarily meant that we would have gotten Medicare for all during his term either. I think it's important to acknowledge that. I think he could have gotten us closer than anyone else would have. And it's difficult to think of someone replacing him, at least in the short or medium term. So I think that, it's hard. It was a hard loss, and we have to acknowledge that. That said, I think that moving forward, the political terrain feels better than it would have without Bernie. I think that he's changed things for the better. The past couple of years, more people have talked about Medicare for all and have come to support it than any time in my lifetime, and probably any time since the 70s, if not the 40s. I mean, there is a considerable amount of popular support for it. The downside, and what I think that people don't understand about the fight for Medicare for all, is that the real problem is that it's fundamentally going to upend a $3.5 trillion industry. It is a fight against capital. It's a massive fight against capital. And it's difficult to imagine getting Medicare for all without an attenuating leftist progressive movement that brings us to a place that looks different than where we are now. So I think it's promising, but daunting. And, you can't really sugarcoat the latter fact.
Yeah, right. That's fair enough. And this is an important thing because I think, when you think about what could have happened if Bernie had been elected, that would have been, what you're talking about is essentially the presidential bully pulpit being used in service of building momentum for Medicare for all, which would have been amazing. But what it wouldn't have meant is that he would have somehow magically, just by virtue of being president, done something that would have led to Medicare for all, passing both houses, getting past any other last minute impediments. I believe that, especially with the conservative Supreme Court majority, but frankly, even with Supreme Court justices who we wouldn't necessarily think of as conservatives, they will come up with, whenever we get to that point, there's an excellent chance that they'll come up with some incredibly creative reason, to think that that major reforms like Medicare for all, would be unconstitutional. Just because you and I don't know what it is doesn't mean that they can't come up with something.
Yeah.
All of those impediments would have still existed. I mean, even if it was Bernie Sanders coming into to this exact situation, most members of the House, never mind the Senate, just are openly not in favor of this.
Yeah, I mean, right now the Senate is still the bigger holdup than the House. Pramila Jayapal just reintroduced the Medicare for All bill in the House and has slightly more than a majority of the Democratic caucus signed on. So that's exciting. Eventually, I believe slightly over half last term did sign on, but they weren't signed on from the get-go. So it does seem like, a little bit of steam has been built. And so that's a good thing. The Senate, if anything, I don't think that it's been reintroduced yet, but, Al Franken was one of the original co-sponsors. He's obviously gone. So, the Senate was around 15, give or take a few Senate co-sponsors. So there's obviously a very long way to go there. But as I keep saying, I think that in terms of organizing, writing a really great bill, and, one great thing about the House bill especially is that it was written in conjunction with many grassroots organizers who have been working on Medicare for All for years. They were really at the table in a very robust and genuine way, helping to write this bill. So I think that there's this beautiful vision advanced in the bill, and a lot of organizing happening at the congressional level, getting people signed on. And that's all a great thing. But I do think that, part of what never made sense to me about some of the force the vote discussion is that until we really get close, you just have no idea who is on the right side and who's not on the right side, because capital is going to put up such an enormous, incomprehensibly large fight against this, and that's the real obstacle. So, squabbling about what Democrats are on and what aren't, I think that's somewhat important in terms of engaging people and organizing, but it's not the real fight, or it's not the biggest fight.
Yeah. So I want to get back to the force the vote stuff in a minute, but I think that I could imagine somebody listening to this and thinking, okay, well, hell, the first half, got me jazzed up about how important it is that, we get Medicare for all. And now I'm hearing all about how, incredibly steep the obstacles are, which they are. But it's, and I don't see what we benefit from, from being dishonest about that. But I think maybe the way to think about this, I mean, obviously this is a really important thing to fight for, both, for all the human reasons that we've been talking about, that, it's so, it's be so profoundly beneficial to achieve this. But also, if you want to advance a left agenda generally, you want to counter the interests of capital, then it makes sense to emphasize something that is that's part of the left's agenda, that's easy to understand, that's very popular, which, and I know that that's sometimes exaggerated, that if you kind of read the fine print of polling data, some people are confused about the differences, between different, health reform ideas. But, broadly speaking, it is incredibly popular. Yeah. Most, which makes, I mean, it'd be weird if it wasn't, right? If you go to most people who aren't political obsessives and say, how would you feel if instead of constantly worrying about losing your health insurance and surprise bills and all this stuff, the government just picked up the tab for everybody's health insurance?
Yeah.
You'd be like a strange person if you're like, no. I care. I like my Blue Cross Blue Shield. Thank you very much. I want none of this. So it makes sense to emphasize it, but it's not something that could be achieved quickly, under present circumstances, because the resistance is so incredibly steep. You already got into a little bit of this, but for one thing, the health care sector generally, all of which is currently based around the private insurance system, is a huge chunk of the U.S. economy.
Yeah, I think that what you're saying makes perfect sense. And overall, you can squabble about the margins and some of the specifics, and how public opinion changes when they phrase the question in a certain way, or emphasize scary things like, oh, even if you lose your insurance, things like that. Overall, we know that Medicare for All is popular, and it absolutely should be, and that's not a surprising thing. And so I think for that reason, it makes sense to center it in a leftist vision, and a way to get people to understand what the leftist agenda is, to get people to understand the difference between, a Bernie Sanders style of politics and a Hillary Clinton style of politics, and, as a way to explain what kind of world we're looking for. And certainly as a thing to organize around. I think that the centering of Medicare for All at some point kind of confused people and got them thinking, and it's a bill that exists in the House, thinking that it's this bill that's, on the verge of passing or that we could pass. And, there are types of bills where calling your congressperson, like lobbying strictly in that sense, can push it over the top. And I think people don't quite understand what it is that Medicare for all would represent. Depending on how you frame and define it, it's among the most redistributive pieces of legislation in American history. Like I said, it fundamentally upends a $3.5 trillion industry. It eliminates full scale, the insurance industry itself, but in changing how hospitals are paid and changing how pharmaceutical companies, device companies, et cetera, are paid, it really does challenge and upend those industries. And, those industries are not just owned by massive, CEOs and private equity firms, although they are increasingly, and that's a problem. There are also tons of public pension funds invested in healthcare companies and, 401ks, et cetera. So, the amount of capital that is invested in the status quo is considerable. And as leftists, that shouldn't push us away. But I do think it's a way of understanding how big this demand is, and it will take basically, a reorientation of the political landscape on a pretty significant order. And I think that that's what we need for a variety of reasons, not just for Medicare for all, but you have to see it in that context.
Yeah, like one way to think about this, like to tie back into the first half of the show tonight, is that all of the things that from our perspective would make it so good and desirable to have Medicare for all are all ways in which it would adversely affect the interests of people who are much more powerful than us. Mm-hmm. The fact that most people, would save a lot of money, et cetera, because it's incredibly redistributive, so people, so that, would be, like, again, that's something that's obviously bad, for the interests of, wealthy people, who would be paying more. The fact that it would give people so much more freedom in all the senses that Abdul was talking about earlier, that like, you'd be much less worried about pissing off your boss if you weren't worried that would mean that you'd lose your health insurance. But for the same reason, that means that your boss has a vested interest in keeping the system of private, mostly employer-based health insurance. The fact that the ways that it would have all these cost-cutting advantages. Okay, if you have a single payer, they can dictate prices, to everywhere else in the system, obviously is a very good and desirable thing. But that also means that everybody who is currently able to, to bill private insurance companies for way more than they would be able to bill, this Medicare for All program for, everybody who's in that position has a vested interest in stopping it. And obviously, I think all of those interests can be overcome. Whatever. I'm a socialist. I think that they can, I think they can be overcome and, eliminated, expropriated, whatever. But it's not a small or simple undertaking. It's certainly not anything that there's any conceivable scenario by which it's going to happen like this congressional session or like the next congressional session, because you need to, like you're saying, you need to fundamentally change the political, landscape, which I understand, people get depressed when they hear it, because it sounds so daunting.
Yeah. I want to be careful about saying that it can't happen in a given time. Certainly political conditions can change rapidly. And I was pretty intentional about saying, it's not necessarily the case that we would have gotten it during a Bernie term. And ultimately, I think we wouldn't have. I do think that there's just too much work still left to be done. But the coronavirus has taught us a lot of things, one of which being that political conditions can change very unexpectedly and very suddenly. So, as far as I'm able to see into the future, I think that we're going to need a few years on this, but I can't see into the future. So
sure, right. I mean, you could have dramatic political earthquakes that could happen 6 months from now. And that, I mean, I take the point, right? I mean, that is an important thing to remember, so
it's a caveat, but
but it's an important caveat. It's one that is that's for sure worth making. But this takes us. So this takes us to the article that you wrote for The Nation. So Forrest, do you have the clip that we're going to play for this? All right. So because this is, of course, as anybody who watches or listens to this show or others like it, and wasn't doing something better with their lives a couple months ago was something that a lot of political energy on the left, ended up being spent on this question. And a lot of people got very mad at each other about this. And my hope is that now maybe, enough time has passed that, that we can sort of take a breath, and maybe see the underlying strategic issues a little bit more clearly than they were in the heat of the moment. But the Nation magazine tried to, I think do just that, right? By bringing the question back up, these few months later, and there was another writer who did the other side of the case that, next time, like, the opportunity arises, we should try to force a vote on Medicare for all. And you did the no, this still doesn't make sense. This still isn't the right, strategic calculation side of it. So let's watch the clip from the last time people were talking about this.
And I'm just really glad that you came out with it, because I think it sparked a response in people. It immediately caught on, even among people who don't typically necessarily appreciate your point of view, Jimmy. And I think that we shouldn't ignore when something sparks kind of movement energy. You can't always plan for it. You can't always anticipate what's going to catch on. But when you identify it, I don't think you should ignore the power that moment holds. But this germ of an idea, I think the aspect of having Nancy Pelosi kind of bent over the proverbial barrel, the idea of fighting for Medicare for all in the middle of a pandemic, this energizes people, and I think that we should act on it.
No doubt about it. I mean, it's always been mass movements that pressure politicians to do what they're supposed to do. And there's a lot of talk right now. We need to wait for a new chairman of a committee and change a rule. And then we have to get a petition to send to Joe Biden. And while all those things are good ideas, and if in a perfect world, I'd like all of them, we can't get even the bare minimum, something that AOC campaigned on, which is a floor vote on Medicare for all. I got video after video of her saying over and over, we can't even have a floor vote on Medicare for all. Well, now you can. And so now is the time.
As a writer, right?
Yes.
But I think that the reason why the article was persuasive to the extent that it was, is I think a lot of folks didn't understand the why, what's the point. They felt as though a lot of the commentaries seemed to think that the goal was passing the bill. And so there was a lot of pushback that said, oh, well, what's the point? We're not going to pass it anyway. And somehow we're going to lose political capital in trying, which I think that that's a little overstated. I think that, first of all, the people who would be holding Nancy Pelosi hostage here are all progressive that are beloved in solidly blue districts. AOC is not going anywhere. Ilhan Omar is not going anywhere. Pramila Jayapal is not going anywhere, right? And additionally, when you compare that relatively slim amount of rhetorical cost against the potential gain of having a substantive conversation about these issues, that's the piece I think that people were missing. And to those who say, well, why do you think the media is going to play ball? Why do you think they're going to be cooperative? The fact that the media doesn't play ball is the problem. Yeah. The reason we're in a place where there's such a huge, enormous gap between where Americans are and what the media pretends, or where Americans are and what Democratic Congress people are willing to support is exactly because the media isn't exposing the extent to which these politicians are basically bought, right? And we're not talking about the fact that Jim Clyburn is supporting Joe Biden, and both of them took the most pharmaceutical money. Joe Biden, obviously, in the electoral context, and Jim Clyburn in the context of the Senate, of all of Congress, actually, you know? So I think that this is a moment where we could really expose the hypocrisy of the Democratic Party. And if you could point me to another better moment, I would be open to saying, hey, let's go with that. But we are in the middle of a pandemic that has just kicked 14 million plus people off of their employer-based healthcare. You know, 300,000 Americans have died. I can't imagine a better context to force Democrats to reckon with the fact that they're still saying, I don't believe that healthcare is a human right.
All right. So, so what's the case for for doing this that was presented there, and I think that, I mean, certainly in terms of that, what happened back then, I mean, you think that this case would have to be overwhelming, to justify what was happening, because in practice, what happened around this was that the most fervent supporters of Medicare for All in Congress, people like AOC, people like Ilhan Omar, Rashida Tlaib, were being demonized and among a certain segment of the left, or the online left, maybe at least, people who pay attention to these debates, were being delegitimized. We're told that there's really no reason to support these people, and so you'd think that if that was going on around this tactical discussion, the case for doing that tactic would have to be overwhelming. Now maybe now with less of that going on, it could just be pretty good, instead of overwhelming. But what I heard mostly in that clip was that doing this would expose the hypocrisy of the Democratic Party, and it was the best opportunity to do that. So what do you make of that argument?
I mean, I've had a lot of issues with this argument. I think that ultimately my issue with it is that it conflates a lot of the reasons that the Democrats are bad, which is, I think that, the fact that moneyed interests and capital have such a stranglehold over our political system is why politicians are bad, not the other way around. That's not to excuse politicians. I think that it's very important to hold them accountable, to push them, to use them as tools. I think that that's, at the center of any leftist ideology when it comes to electoral politics. But yeah, I was very skeptical. First of all, I think that the idea that by exposing Democrats, you advance this movement forward and, you expose them and you change people's minds about them. I think that that's on a very shallow level predicated on an understanding and level of popularity that I wish Medicare for All had, but it doesn't. I mean, I think that its popularity is conditional based on how the question is asked, based on how it's framed, et cetera. So the idea that, this is just such an unequivocally, unambiguously winning issue that you could leverage support for it against a vote that no one would know about. I think that was another thing. This would be basically a parliamentary 15-minute no vote. It would get barely, maybe it would get some coverage because of the dust up.
Yeah, and I should say that was, I thought, one of the strangest parts of that clip, that, that like she's brought up that argument and then said, oh, but the fact that the media is like this is the problem. And it was very unclear to me, at least, how that was supposed to address that point, that it's like, yes, the media is a problem. The media sucks. Everybody in this discussion agrees on that, right? But the issue is that given that we have the media that sucks, why do you think we'd have this wonderful public debate, because of the because of this like 15-minute, parliamentary procedural thing that, maybe, I guess, if you were watching C-SPAN 2, you would see on there.
Yeah, I mean, it just wouldn't reach the majority of people. I mean, several months back or a couple of years back, I forget, there was a, procedural floor vote on the Green New Deal. And basically what happened was Democrats, even the ones who supported it and were co-sponsors, refused to vote because they thought it was a dirty tactic. And, no one really heard about it either way. I'm just not convinced that it would have created this show-stopping piece of political theater that people were alluding to, or that watching a vote for it lose in that context would have galvanized support for it rather than the other way around. I mean, I think that no part of the premise made sense. And so ultimately what I was getting at in the piece that I wrote for The Nation, and it was only, it was 800 words. It was this tiny column that was run alongside The Other Side. And it was, I was talking to the editor and he said, do you want to take the position that, no, we shouldn't push for a floor vote in the future? And I basically said, I tried to put as much nuance in the column as possible, but I said, basically my position on this is I'm not opposed to a floor vote per se. I think that power, having, worker power, grassroots power from below is going to be the thing that makes a floor vote effective. And so that's what we need to wait for. When the movement has enough power to really force concessions or to force, punishment, sanctions in some way onto the people that don't vote for it, or to pressure them to, and really create this groundswell of pressure, then I think we should do it. I think that it will be powerful at that point, but I think that we have to realize where we are, and that if we can't exercise that type of power, a procedural tactical power play doesn't look like anything.
Yeah,
I think
it looks like it losing almost 2-1 because you said a little over half the Democratic caucus supports it, which is amazing progress compared to 3 years ago. That's it's hard to remember how bad things were then, right? But okay, a little over half the Democratic caucus in a House that's divided almost 50-50 along partisan lines means that it's it would. That okay, all of the Republicans and almost half the Democrats voted against it. That's about 2-1, and that's how a 2-1 defeat plays. I mean, yeah, maybe there are circumstances under which that would lead to this groundswell of anger. It's very hard to believe that those are the circumstances that we're living in right now. And this goes to your point about popularity. You have different polls depending on how you ask the question, say different things. There are, of course, all those polls where if you sort of work in the anti-M4A arguments into the poll, it's would you still support it if you knew that you might lose your employer or your health insurance? That it becomes a minority. And of course, there's a sense in which that's almost silly. It's yeah, sure. I mean, anytime you ask people in poll, you bring up the arguments against something and not any of the standard responses to it, then that's going to affect it. But it also does speak to shallowness of support that people think, sure, it's a good idea, but then the first time they're reminded of one of the objections to it, tons of those people stop supporting it. And under those circumstances, you just can't assume that anybody who says, sure, I'd like government health insurance in a poll is going to be so angrily, passionately in favor of it. They'll be outraged that their congressman voted against it. Yeah.
I mean, that's the point of organizing, right? Public education, inoculating them against that onslaught, which I keep saying, as soon as this becomes more likely and more plausible, I mean, the amount of pushback is going to become obscene and intense. So whatever pushback we think we've gotten so far, just wait. And that what that takes is a lot of solidarity, a lot of knocking on doors, a lot of conversations with people. I mean, it's not a perfect analogy, but I think that you could look at union campaigns, right? Part of why it's really hard to get a majority of workers to vote for a union is because management is allowed to completely mislead them, is allowed to smear the concept of campaigns, is allowed to put the fear of God in all of these workers for various reasons. And that a lot of what that takes to combat is, not only solidarity, but making sure that people absolutely understand why it's necessary. They understand why these arguments are disingenuous. They understand why, even if someone is saying, oh, you'll lose your health insurance, this will happen, that'll happen, here are the good things that will happen anyway. And the fact is, most people aren't at the point where, they're able to either, they don't know the policy that well, or they don't have like solidaristic political commitments that make them trust the people who are saying this and who are fighting for it, and that we need to get to that point. But, it takes a while for us to become more convincing than the $3.5 trillion that we're up against. And I don't care how good your tweets are. I don't care, how morally reductive a point that you can make on TV. Much better than I can, for what it's worth. I think that, I can concede when a point sounds really good and powerful, and that I'm not as good at doing that. But ultimately, it's going to take building those relationships, fortifying that base, and that takes time and elbow grease, and you can't skip it. And like you've said so many times, there's not one cool magic trick.
Right. Forrest, I cut you off earlier. What were you saying?
No, I was just saying, I think that I don't know, there's kind of like, obviously, number one, like a role-playing element of what somebody like Jimmy Dore is doing, where it's kind of just like telling people what they want to hear through just, I don't know, just being like, oh, we could be powerful. We could be powerful. Like, these people don't want you to have healthcare. That's why we're not powerful. But Jimmy Dore is never going to like roll up his sleeves and go knock on doors for anything. You know what I mean? Like, that part of the equation, I think for a lot of people on the left is completely skipped if they don't have an organizing background. But the other thing is that it's kind of framed in that clip as like an enlightenment moment, as in like, they act like everyone is a Democratic partisan, I guess. And then by exposing that they don't really want to have, like, they don't really want you to have Medicare for all of a sudden people, like, a light bulb goes off in their head and they're like, wow, you know what? These politicians are really corrupt. The thing is, most people think that already. Like, I was going to pull up like Congress's approval ratings. Like, their approval ratings never go up past 30%. Like, most people don't fucking like Congress. Most people don't like politicians. And like the thing isn't that they feel like, the thing isn't that normal people that aren't like super engaged in politics don't feel like it's not like they think it's a team sport. It's just they think that they can't change anything. And by exposing Democratic hypocrisy, they're just going to say, yeah, of course they're hypocrites. Like, of course, like, all right, like, keep going about your day. You know what I mean? Like,
yeah, and it's also, I mean, I think that the other part of the point, like going back to Natalie's point about, the popularity and whether it's secure enough, right? Like, I really like that analogy about the union organizing campaign, about how, like, there's a difference between, look, I mean, there's a reason why it would be so amazing to have a card check, that all you could do is have, say, tell a worker, hey, how would you like to have a union? Them say, yeah, sure. They sign a card and that's it. That's the vote, rather than going through this process where they can, get like employer propaganda and fear mongering and then back off. Because it's much easier to get people to the point where they say, oh, yeah, sure, all I have to do is sign this card, than it is to get people to the point where even after all the employer propaganda and fear-mongering, they'll stick to their guns.
Yeah.
And yeah, by analogy, in the healthcare case, I mean, like, the poll answer is the signing the union card.
Yeah. I also think, I mean, of all the things that drove me crazy about this whole incident, which there are many things, but one thing that drove me crazy was, if the idea was exposing Democrats who are opposed to this, then hypothetically, what you were supposed to do with those Democrats was primary them. And we don't have anywhere near enough power to primary that many Democrats at once. But getting to the point where you could would take organizing and power building, which is what I was talking about in the first place. Like, if we did force the vote, I don't really think anything would have happened, but okay, let's say, you know, Force the Vote gave you a list of Democrats that you could knock on the door and tell people like, oh, this person voted against Medicare for all, which by the way, you can already make that point with like, here's the co-sponsor list of the legislation if you want to. And I think people should use that, like definitely go up to doors and like make a big thing of that. I think that that's good propaganda. If you think that this would have made slightly better propaganda, okay, fine. What you have is a punchy line in a canvassing strip, and you still have to send people to doors. You still have to like fundraise from grassroots activists. You still have to go up against whatever interests are funding their opponent. And we know like the left has had some amazing successes over the past couple of years with primarying centrist Democrats, but we know that it's hard, and we know that it takes power and organizing to do. So it just drove me crazy that like, okay, however you go, organizing is going to be the answer every time.
Yeah, like having it something to say while you're at the door is different from having the people to knock on the doors, is different from having, you know, the money raised to do it, you know, etc. Like, I mean, it's, again, the situation is vastly better than it was, you know, like unfathomably better than it was in like 2016, you know, or even 2018, you know, the year that there were those initial squad breakthroughs. But it's not like you know, this idea, because if you were primarying anybody who voted no in that symbolic, you know, floor vote, which I mean, I'm sure a lot of people would skip it anyway, but, you know, so like this idea that, oh, this will force them to go on record. It's like, well, no, actually, like nobody forces you to vote on anything. You know, you can skip whatever vote you want, but so if anybody is like really like wants to not be on record, that's a very easy way to do that. But even so, right, I mean, what we're talking about is almost half of the Democratic caucus. The idea that the left isn't anywhere near the position to simultaneously primary half of the Democratic caucus is just very weird. And meanwhile, like, you're missing, like, anybody making this argument is missing the other half of it, which you kind of alluded to earlier, which is the potential downside, which is that, like, okay, why is it, like, even among people who maybe are secure enough in what they think, right, that they're not going to, like, switch their position in the poll, like how they would answer the poll question the second it's rephrased, which, again, the unfortunate reality is a lot of people who support Medicare for all, it's such a weak support that, like, the second that the question is asked slightly differently, they're against it. But even people who aren't like that, I think there are lots of people who aren't like that, who aren't mad that about the Democrats not doing Medicare for all, and they're not mad about it because it just doesn't sound like something that's really going to happen to them. Like it's people, like, there's lots of stuff that people would love it if the government did, but they're not worked up about it because they never expected it to happen in the first place. And it seems, and to the extent that you think that that's like the big problem, like why is it that we haven't had, okay, so we're in a pandemic, but obviously that creates a problem for doing any sort of political activity outside of the house. But nevertheless, despite being in a pandemic, last summer we had giant police brutality protests. So the question is, okay, given some of these poll numbers, the ones that sound better, why don't we have giant protests about all those people in the poll? Given that so many people lost their employer health insurance during the pandemic, why don't we have giant protests about Medicare for all? And I mean, I guess if you want to, you can blame, some leaders or politicians just being treacherous and not wanting it enough. But I mean, it seems like realistically, you didn't have that because most people only get mad that things aren't happening when they think that they might happen. And if that's the case, then having a 2-to-1 defeat in a floor vote, to the extent that anybody notices that happens, it seems like it would just deepen the problem.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there are a few ways to understand why you don't see massive protest mobilizing for healthcare in the same way that you do for other issues. For one thing, there is some healthcare mobilization. I mean, I've definitely been to several Medicare for All rallies. I'm not sure if you have. I bet that a lot of audience members have too, especially in, California still has a pretty active state level fight. New York, possibly a couple of other states too, have visible action. So, there's some of it. There's also sometimes some action around hospital closures. So Hahnemann in Philadelphia, maybe about 2 years ago, was a safety net hospital that closed. And the Bernie campaign actually went there and, did a solidaristic protest against that closure. So I think ultimately we don't see as much of it. And I think that's a few reasons. One, there was also like the protests against the repeal and replace bills, particularly in defense of Medicaid, which, the ADAPT group doing sit-ins at the direct actions at Capitol. So that's something. So I think a few things are at play. One, around 15 million people lost their employer-sponsored insurance during the pandemic. It's still unclear, and researchers are still debating how many people from that cohort became uninsured. A lot of them were absorbed by Medicaid temporarily. Potentially some switched on to spouse's insurance, things like that. So it's a little, I still think that's still bad. Like that sort of churn is what it's called. Switching from one plan to another can still be really difficult for people. They can still wind up with terrible bills. They can still lose continuity of care. So I'm not saying that it's not awful. I don't think that we should have that in our system at all. But, it changes. If you're thinking 15 million people all of a sudden losing insurance, when you think about, oh my gosh, that sounds like such a catastrophe, it wasn't necessarily experienced that way to the degree that sounds. But I also just think the choke points in the healthcare system are not clear. So that's the point I was trying to make from the get-go. I think that, when you think about a worker's place in a business, the way that a boss needs labor to make profit and the power that the workers wield as a result is very clear, right? It can be hard to exercise that power, but we understand that. We have, a way of dissecting that. We have a way of talking about that. Patients don't have that kind of power. Ultimately, we all need healthcare. And so I think that a lot of Medicare for All organizing is kind of geared toward helping us think about ourselves and each other as, if you're not a patient now, you'll have to be, and sort of thinking about it as like a solidaristic public good. But patients can't strike. Patients can't exercise they can't, you could start to talk about what they can do as consumers, but I think that is problematic because we're trying not to be consumers, right? We're trying to have a much different relationship with the system than that would suggest. And I think that, there are people, nurses being the most prominent example of a healthcare worker who is very committed to Medicare for All. And that, there have been some nurse strikes where they try to raise awareness of Medicare for All, but there's never been mass labor action in that way. Things like, unless the PRO Act gets passed, sympathy strikes are illegal. So I think that, the contours of what it takes to use direct action to get Medicare for All is maybe less obvious for healthcare than it might be for, some other issue. So I don't think that that's insurmountable. I do think that the political contours are tricky.
Yeah. No, fair. Fair enough. And again, goes back to the point that this is, that this is something that's a really difficult long haul struggle, which is not said to discourage anybody from being engaged in that struggle. I mean, just the opposite, right? So that shows that we need to to do this because it is so important to achieve, and it's going to be so hard, So I mean that's a reason to that is actually a reason to put more of your energy into it, because it's going to take more to do. But being burnt out, by like the sort of spectacle of thinking that that there's going to be a quick fix, is probably the opposite of the kind of mindset that people need in order to engage in that long-term organizing effort. So I do want to I want to be respectful of your time. So I want to switch gears while we still got you, and see if we're not going to get to everything that we want to get to. But I at least wanted to do the vaccine distribution part. Forrest, do you have that?
Yeah. So a big part of Biden's, I guess we hit like a year since the lockdown happened, like last year. So Biden gave his big COVID address. And I kind of wanted to start with this on it, because like the point that we're at with vaccines is a lot better, obviously, than we were at Trump. And I know you wrote kind of an article about vaccine distribution at the beginning of Biden's term. So I don't know.
Did you do the screen share? I don't see it.
We're also working with governors and mayors in red states and blue states to set up and support nearly 600 federally supported vaccination centers that administers hundreds of thousands of shots per day. You can drive up to a stadium or a large parking lot, get your shot, never leave your car, and drive home in less than an hour. We've been sending vaccines to hundreds of community health centers all across America, located in underserved areas. And we've been deploying, and we will deploy more mobile vehicles and pop-up clinics to meet you where you live, so those who are least able to get the vaccine are able to get it. We continue to work on making at-home testing available. And we've been focused on serving people in the hardest hit communities of this pandemic: Black, Latino, Native American, and rural communities. So what does all this add up to? When I took office 50 days ago, only 8% of Americans, after months, only 8% of those over the age of 65 had gotten their first vaccination. Today, that number is 65%. Just 14% of Americans over the age of 75, 50 days ago had gotten their first shot. Today, that number is well over 70%. When I came into office, you may recall, I set a goal that many of you said was that kind of way over the top. I said I intended to get 100 million shots in people's arms in my first 100 days in office. Tonight, I can say we're not only going to meet that goal, we're going to beat that goal, because we've actually on track to reach this goal of 100 million shots in arms on my 60th day in office. No other country in the world has done this. None. And I want to talk about the next steps we're thinking about. First, tonight, I'm announcing that I will direct all states, tribes, and territories to make all adults, people 18 and over, eligible to be vaccinated no later than May 1. Let me say that again. All adult Americans will be eligible to get a vaccine no later than May 1. That's much earlier than expected. Let me be clear. That doesn't mean everyone's going to have that shot immediately, but it means you'll be able to get in line beginning May 1. Every adult will be eligible to get their shot. And to do this, we're going to go from 1 million shots a day that I promised in December, before I was sworn in, to maintaining, beating our current pace of 2 million shots a day, outpacing the rest of the world. Secondly, at the time when every adult is eligible in May, we will launch with our partners new tools to make it easier for you to find the vaccine and where to get the shot, including a new website that will help you first find the place to get vaccinated and the one nearest you. No more searching day and night for an appointment for you and your loved ones. Thirdly, with the passage of the American Rescue Plan, and I thank again the House and Senate for passing it, and my announcement last month of a plan to vaccinate teachers and school staff, including bus drivers, we can accelerate massive nationwide effort to reopen our schools safely and meet my goal that I stated at the same time, about 100 million shots, of opening a majority of K through 8 schools in my first 100 days in office. This is going to be the #1 priority of my new Secretary of Education, Miguel Cardona. Fourth, in the coming weeks, we will issue further guidance on what you can and cannot do once fully vaccinated to lessen the confusion, to keep people safe, and encourage more people to get vaccinated.
All right. So, Natalie, you want to tell us about your vaccine distribution article and where things are at with this right now?
Sure. Yeah. So for the nation, I guess it was a month or two ago at this point, I did like a long, deep piece into vaccine distribution, kind of zoomed out look at all of the issues with it. And one thing that I think has been overlooked, and I think that the biggest root explanation for a lot of problems, particularly earlier on, was the fact that public health departments were begging for federal money to run their vaccine distribution programs since, early summer, when it started to be clear that some of these vaccines were pretty promising. And they didn't get that funding approved until the second COVID relief bill at the end of December. And then it took another month or so before most of the departments actually got that money, which of course was, over 2 months or around 2 months into vaccine distribution. It had already started. And that's better late than never. But that basically means that for the largest mass vaccination program in American history, which, we've obviously done a lot of vaccinations and there are things that everyone gets vaccinated for, but they don't happen all at once, right? Like there's never been a time when all 300 million people in a country have to be vaccinated at once. And there's no real mechanism for that. They had to devise a lot of protocols and systems that didn't exist, and not knowing whether they'd get the money, they couldn't hire new people. If you'll also remember, a lot of public health departments are seriously cash strapped, particularly, a lot of them lost a ton of funding in the austerity after the 2008 crash, and in a lot of cases haven't been replenished. And so, you had these public health departments that basically had to coordinate on a dime. And I think that a lot of them tried to do that really effectively. I talked to, a ton of people trying to run their vaccination programs in local county X, and they were, developing volunteer programs, and they were, using Eventbrite websites to try to coordinate signups, blah, blah, blah. But the reason that it was so hard, there were so many kerfuffles, is because this money came way too late, and they basically had to design or improvise systems in the meantime. And if you have to improvise systems without any money, that basically means that you're going to prioritize passive mechanisms, right? Like if you're using Eventbrite software, you're basically going to say, okay, we'll set up a thing here, you come to us. And I think it's pretty obvious who's best able to navigate those systems, who's the one who's able to, be available midday to game the system, to keep logging on, to figure out where the appointments are, to, go to the one that opens up wherever they can. And, they were going to prioritize richer, whiter people. And that's, what happened. I think that places that did the best are places that were able to exercise a certain amount of flexibility in a targeted way. So, the place that I wrote about in that piece was a town called Central Falls, Rhode Island, which had the highest rate of infection in the state of Rhode Island. And, I think on par with some pretty hard hit areas. It's the only majority POC city in the country or in the state, and had the highest rates of poverty. And basically they trained locals, so people from the local community, to be health ambassadors, to, earlier on in the pandemic, to, talk to people about masking and get people enrolled in clinical trials and, talk to them about infection mitigation protocol. And they were able to get mask usage rates up, et cetera. And then they were also being used to help people sign up to actually, go to public housing, to, vaccinate entire buildings. They would also sit outside the Dollar Tree and City Hall, et cetera. And that they ended up being very successful because they were sending out healthcare workers to these hardest hit areas and these marginalized communities. And, more places have started taking up that model, especially now that funding is available and they have been able to hire more people to do that work. Ultimately getting people vaccinated and distributing vaccines, you need especially with the first two, the Pfizer and the Moderna, where you have to have this really intense cold chain technology because it had to be kept so cold. Now with Johnson & Johnson, the actual distribution is a little easier. There are still hiccups here and there, but the situation is a lot smoother than it was. And, I think that people still don't totally get, and pundits don't seem to get, when they said, like, well, why is this so hard? What's going on? I don't vaccinating an entire country has never been done, not in this context. And it's really, really hard. I think it would have been hard no matter what. And there were obviously some pretty significant roadblocks.
Biden seems to be doing a better job with that messaging too, talking about kind of mobilizing people to be vaccinators. That's not something I really heard Trump ever talk about necessarily at all, or like, you know what I mean? Like a lot, like it's interesting that he seems to be catching on to that messaging pretty quickly.
Yeah, I mean, it is like, this is one of the weirdest things about the COVID crisis, because if you imagine like the disaster movie version of COVID, like the one, like how like the Hollywood movie would have gone in the last 20 minutes when people were finally getting vaccinated, it wouldn't be this like, different rules in every state and people going to get vaccinated at CVS and, and all this stuff. It would be like this, line of like, National Guard stuff, set up to vaccinate everybody. That's what you would be primed to expect.
To be fair, the Aaron Sorkin version of it might actually entirely involve people arguing about where to best hand out vaccinations.
The minutiae of the rules for how to do it, and people doing walk and talks talking about how exactly which group should be prioritized. Yeah. But I mean, I think I'm glad that it's happening more. But I mean, the distinction Natalie's making there is really important, because I mean, certainly, anecdotally, like, I have my, I got my first shot, finally last week, and granted, I live out in the middle of nowhere, so like it wouldn't, but like, I had to drive like about half an hour to, to the place where I got it. People I know who wouldn't necessarily qualify for higher risk groups who've gotten it, I tend to hear these stories and know, like, this is not to say anything bad about anybody who, my position is that anybody who has a chance of getting a shot right now should race to take it, but like, people will tell me these stories about, oh, I got a call from such and such, and they said there were some shots at this place that, they couldn't find anybody to get. And all I can think whenever I hear this stuff is, oh, you couldn't find anybody? Like how many, like, what they mean is not enough people came in of their own steam to do it. Like, I really want to know what would happen if, like, how many Walmarts are in between this person who's driving into this place where they couldn't find anybody and the vaccination site, you know, like walk into the Walmart and say, hey, is anybody here, you know, not gotten a shot and wants one? And I'll bet you could find somebody to take all of those doses. But for the most part, that's not how it's being done.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's, you know, it's interesting. Every country is doing it a little bit differently. And I think that part of why in the US you have so many situations like that is, I mean, partially because of our piecemeal healthcare system that, you know, we don't have a system like in the NHS, everyone is enrolled with a primary healthcare provider, and that's kind of like a natural landing pad, and that the person has a list of their patients. Like I talked to, for that piece, I, you know, interviewed people who worked for public health departments, and like, they don't have a list of like, here are the 75 plus year olds who live in this county. Like that doesn't, like that, there's no way to like find that information and use it. There's no way to like reach out to those people. So like without those pre-existing institutional relationships, which by the way, I think is another reason like why it's easy to understand why, you know, childhood immunizations work so much more smoothly, not just that it's fewer people at a time than had to be vaccinated now. But, you know, when you're born, you have an institutional tie to the place where you were born. You know, the pediatrician, the most babies are born in hospitals, and, you know, they're keyed in there, and then, you know, through school. So, you know, people kind of become less tethered to those systems as they get older and become adults. So, you know, for a variety of reasons, and just because, you know, there never was like a streamlined planning process, Biden brought up the idea of, you know, one website exercise, like designed at the federal level that everyone can use, which is like a classic example of something that would have been super convenient to have if the COVID funding had freed up months before. You know, that's one thing that I think states and local health departments really had to bend over backwards trying to figure out. And that, you know, in most cases they didn't, and people keep coming for shots. So it's kind of resolved itself in this strange piecemeal way. But yeah, I mean, the way that it got resolved is that there are a lot of people just kind of doing their own thing. There's like piecemeal processes, people driving 2 hours to get something. There have also been more, you know, vaccination teams dispatched to hard hit areas, which, you know, I think is really what was necessary from the get-go, and what's already done in other contexts. You know, I mean, tuberculosis workers do that now. They, you know, go to where patients are to deliver medication and observe dosages and that kind of thing. But you know, better late than never.
Yeah, having a big federal website like that, though, is also something that can go wrong pretty fast, as we saw with like the Obamacare website when they first launched it, crashing over and over again. Like, I don't know. I think that it's so interesting to see systems fail during a crisis, because, you know, it's not like one system fails and then they fix it and then like another, like it's like all systems fail at once. And having somebody like Trump that's actively kind of fighting against releasing any federal funding, like you really see everything fall apart that quickly. But then at the same time, like somebody like Biden coming in and just kind of doing basic things that would help out a lot, like common sense things, they get way too much praise for that, I feel like. But I mean, you know,
I mean, having the federal website, you know, assuming that it's not, you know, whatever, right? But, you know, making that assumption is definitely a step in the right direction. I mean, that's a good thing. There should be one centralized place you can look up where you can get a vaccine, but also having the only way for people to get vaccines is that they look it up and they find time to go there. Just, I mean, doesn't seem, certainly doesn't seem like the most efficient, you know, way to do it. And
definitely not to vaccinate a whole country.
Yeah,
like,
and it's also definitely not the most egalitarian way to do it for all the reasons that Natalie was talking about. You know, there are like, you know, who's, you know, just having, you know, having it be a matter of, you know, the person who got was sent home with an employer laptop a year ago and is doing their white collar job from home is a lot more likely to get on that website and find, where they can be vaccinated, than some who's, who's working all day and, coming home and worrying about, who's taking care of the kids, et cetera. I mean, it does seem like, if you're going to equalize that at all, and just again get as many people vaccinated as quickly as humanly possible, you really do want to be sending the vaccine to the arms and not the other way around.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, another thing I've said about this before, I think that all of that stuff makes sense. And when it comes to, Trump and his handling of the coronavirus, I feel like I've generally been pretty resistant to arguments that Trump is an anomalous president. I think that, the better way to understand him is that he's the logical endpoint of several years worth of processes in the Republican Party, et cetera. I do think that certain aspects of the coronavirus, Trump was worse than any other Republican would have been. Chief among them is messaging, which sounds like a little thing. Usually when people talk about Trump's civility and Trump's style, it's like, okay, whatever. Like, what's really different between that and the more civil, genteel stylings of George W. Bush? But I think with, helming a country during a pandemic, messaging is really important. Hydroxychloroquine, for example, would never have happened under any other president except Trump. And, Biden's doing a better...
Romney wouldn't have half-jokingly floated injected in bleach.
Yeah.
Clean him out. Just get the virus out.
Yeah. So from that sense, I think Biden is a pretty powerful upgrade. The holding the funding hostage, which I do think was at the crux of why the beginning of the vaccine rollout was such a clusterfuck. I think that would have happened not only under another Republican, but given the structure of votes under that president, probably would have happened under President Hillary Clinton too. I mean, I don't think that the Republicans would have wanted to free that up. So, in that sense, the beginning was going to be a problem. And you're right that federal websites would have been hard, but having a website that was the same everywhere, that was streamlined, and then freeing up local health officials to do other things and to build up their distribution program in other ways, that would have been pretty clearly preferable, and that you'd have to have a bunch of strategies at once. But, ultimately, credit where credit's due, the vaccine distribution really is going way better now.
Yeah, no, I mean, for sure. I mean, those are, the two big things that I was hoping that we get from Biden replacing, Trump, as somebody who was always pretty cynical about, somebody who was always pretty pessimistic, about the prospects for Biden, changing his stripes, were that, one, that he'd stop that he wouldn't appoint hardcore union busters to the NLRB. That's kind of that's not an issue that most people track, but I think they should. And two, that the COVID response, wouldn't be quite as ludicrously, inept and negligent, which again, I agree with you. I don't even think it would have been under another Republican, because it's just from the perspective of, keeping the country running, for the sake of capital, I think any reasonably, competent reactionary politician, would have done better than Trump did. I mean, it's you'd be hard pressed to find a worse person to be there at that particular moment, that we have an unprecedented catastrophe. Who's going to be president right now? It's the weird, it's like the weird racist from Celebrity Apprentice, who talks of consciousness. That's the guy who's going to be, that's the guy who's going to be at the helm at that moment.
Yeah.
And it makes, I mean, as far as a centrist bellwether goes, I guess, this is the time that it that really does matter, having somebody like that in power. I mean, if you're not going to get any genuine leftist that wants to change anything, at the very least, as I guess scientific and popular opinion kind of has one consensus, the consensus guy, it's all right, things are going to improve because like that guy is just going to go with whatever, you know what I mean? Like whatever the current logic of the crisis is.
Yeah. I'll also say this will be cheesy, but I do think it's worth pointing out. It was striking to me. I think it was like Biden's first week in office that he had like a memorial for victims of the coronavirus and like a moment of silence. And it struck me that like how crazy it was that there was never a moment like that of public mourning from Trump. And like, as much as, you know, those things are political theater, et cetera, but it feels like during a pandemic of this magnitude, I think that was meaningful and that was important. And it is just startling when you're like, oh, holy shit, like our former president just presided over the deadliest pandemic in anyone's lifetime and like never acknowledged the dead.
Yeah, right. Like, I guess I won't say it's at the worst end of the spectrum.
No, it's just surprising
of possible responses. Like the very worst end of the spectrum of public responses is Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil, who was like giving, you know, press conferences about how like if you were a real man, you wouldn't be so worried about getting the virus. You know, like that's, you know, like so it could be even worse. But you know, but yeah, the Trump response was pretty close to the worst end of how somebody in that position could have handled it. But before we let Natalie go, Forrest, you had a Fauci clip?
Yeah. So this is it came up a couple of days ago, and Fauci was talking to, I think, people on the pharma side of the healthcare spectrum at like some conference, and he's talking about how he was talking about how he doesn't agree with price controls on the COVID vaccine. And I thought it would be interesting to talk about the limits of capitalism in healthcare.
All right. While he's pulling that up, we have a super chat from Darius Hennon, who asks, would Congress feel more compelled to act on M4A if states started their own programs first and were successful? Any thoughts about that?
Yeah, so I think that there are a lot of legal challenges with state level single payer that try to be ameliorated. Ro Khanna has introduced a bill that would basically do things like reallocate Medicare funding that goes to a certain state into a state single payer pool. So it kind of tries to smooth over and fix some of those legal complications. Right now, there is no mechanism to do that. So it's unclear how easy it would be, et cetera. You know, states also can't command the same bargaining power that the federal government can. There are a lot of states, you know, like New York, where a lot of their providers are used by people from out of state and vice versa. So there would be some kinks and some challenges, and it wouldn't be able to deliver the same promise as a federal level single payer program. But I do think that it's where some of the political conditions are more amenable right now, and that there are some states where there's, you know, a years long organizing campaign already in place, and that those are a great thing to key into. And those bills give you a reason to knock on doors, as opposed to just like, you know, knocking on doors to talk about a hypothetical bill at the national level, which can be a little harder. I think that those conversations potentially get easier at the local or state level. And, you know, it is worth noting that that is how the Canadian program got won. Saskatchewan was the first province to have it, and then it was eventually rolled out over the course of a few more decades. I prefer the national route, but I think that we should be, you know, pushing any model we can. And there's not, as far as I understand, there's not like a single state level single payer supporter alive who doesn't want national level single payer too. So, you know, the idea of like what's better, state or national, is, you know, knock on wood, ultimately just a tactical question. But yeah, I mean, if you are in a state with a robust single payer movement, definitely get keyed into it. It's a great way to organize.
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense to me, like, even though, I mean, obviously everything you said about like the drawbacks of, you know, of state like the things that you could deliver with national single payer that that you can't with any kind of state level program. Is definitely right, and of course and for sure right, the goal is national single payer. But I kind of like the idea, like where it is politically possible, where there are like if there are states where there's enough momentum that could actually conceivably happen at a state level. I kind of like the idea of pursuing that. Just because I do tend to think that a big part of the problem right now with mobilizing people around single payer is that even so many people who like the idea like have that kind of bone deep capitalist realism. It just doesn't sound like something that would really happen. And so if you can like point to like, oh yeah, in California they have Cali Care or whatever, that like everybody who lives there gets automatically like that. Like that just makes it, that would be something that would make it seem more real. It's like, oh yeah, sure, they have that in California. Why couldn't we have that nationally?
Yeah, I think one problem, industry, if it sees the writing on the wall in that way, would absolutely jump on a state level campaign and would find it much easier to topple than a national level campaign. So the influx of opposition would be even more of a threat at the state level. Right. So I think if it gets to that point, Medicare for All supporters in other states will have to, really extend solidarity and think of it as their fight too, even if they're not in the state in question. But yeah, I mean, it would be great to see bills, advance further. And they've passed at least one chamber in New York and California over the past couple of years. So that is a big deal. And, I'd love to see more of that.
Fair enough. All right, let's do the Fauci clip.
There's obviously a lot of discussion about access and affordability of any future vaccine or therapeutic interventions for COVID. And I know our companies are working closely with the US government and others around the world to make sure that a vaccine can be made broadly available. You've commented before that in your experience during past public health emergencies, that the private sector has been a good partner and not priced vaccines in a way that had made them unaffordable. Yet there are some who want to impose price controls on the products before they're developed. Would such efforts help or hurt your ability to partner with the private sector in bringing new vaccines to market?
So this is what's called get Tony in trouble question.
Those are the fun ones, aren't they?
Yeah, those are the real fun for you. But then when we're done, it's not so much fun for me. No, I mean, I have a lot of experience over the years dealing with pharmaceutical companies in which we're trying to develop an intervention. And the one thing that is clear is that if you try to enforce things on a company that has multiple different opportunities to do different things, they'll walk away. They will walk away. So as much as you'd like to see fair pricing, I think to force something on a company as opposed to work with them to try and get an understanding, particularly if the federal government helps them in the development of a product for a public health issue, that they will in good faith make it available to those groups, countries, nations that really can't afford it very well. You don't want them to be, I mean, obviously it's a profit-driven industry. You people know that a heck of a lot more than I do because I don't deal in that space. I just deal with the people who deal in that space. And when you're dealing with something that has to have some kind of an economic return, you can't just do something and just give it away. You've got to have some degree of profit. And that has to be taken into consideration, as long as it isn't in such an outrageous way that it completely makes something out of the realm of the people who really need it. And often, I mean, I feel like I'm preaching. I'm sorry, but I'm telling you things you already know very well, that many of these outbreaks disproportionately affect regions of the world that cannot afford a very expensive intervention. So that's the reason why we've got to work with each other in good faith, that we're going to help. But I don't see I've never seen a successful attempt at doing controls. And people ask, and the Congress asks, well, why don't you just say that you have, but there's a reasonable pricing clause that you might remember from way back in some laws that were passed. The big question is, what is a reasonable price? That was something that was very difficult in agreeing upon.
So I have
Thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, in a nutshell, he's not wrong, but the answer isn't, as a result, we have to let pharma do what it wants. The answer is public manufacture of pharmaceutical goods. Right. So that's the way forward. I've been advocating that for a while. It seems pretty straightforward to me. I mean, he's right. Like, they are for-profit industries. You can't expect them to give these things away for free. They depend on profit, et cetera. And that's why they shouldn't be producing these goods. I mean, that's why we should build an institution that doesn't require them.
Yeah, that's kind of where I don't know, wanted to hear the conversation go, in the sense of, like, just the systemic failing of capitalism to deal with a crisis like this. And, like, having for-profit industries, I guess, in charge of the response to a crisis like this just seems like a massive failure on a moral scale, but also just like on a distribution scale. Like, I know Ben's written about that for Jacobin before.
Yeah, no, for sure. And I mean, this is something that Lee Phillips and Mikhail Rozhwersky talk about in People's Republic of Walmart. That having, yeah, I always recommend that. That having, for-profit, pharmaceutical companies, having, control over the direction of research is, potentially catastrophic, I mean, in terms of, the sort of race to, to have antibiotics, that catch up to the evolution of the organisms, they're trying to counter, which is something that could, sooner than we'd like to think, I mean, could really have devastating effects, because if you don't have workable antibiotics, I mean, then you're sort of back to Victorian medicine and, lopping off limbs. And the reason, and the reason for that is that that's just not where the profit, incentives, line up with, it's, and or you could even think about the COVID vaccine, which, of course, it's remarkable how quickly that we got it anyway. Although, as Abdul pointed out in the first half, that's public R&D anyway, as far as most of the funding goes. But there's also a question about why there wasn't massive research money being put into coronaviruses after SARS and MERS, which were both near misses for the kind of thing, that is happening right now, globally with COVID. And I mean, you don't have to say anything conspiratorial about that. It's just straightforwardly looking ahead to things that might or might not be a big problem in 5 or 10 years.
There's literally videos of scientists being like, the next thing is going to be some form of coronavirus, just so, everyone is aware, that's the next pandemic that's going to hit.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, yeah.
Oh yeah. So, I want to, so I said public manufacture, I think, is the ultimate solution to this problem. It's not as if there's nothing you can do up to that point. I mean, other countries can and do more effectively regulate their pharmaceutical prices better than we do. There's a different, regulating pharmaceutical prices without changing the insurance system won't be as helpful to patients. If you have a $6,000 deductible, a certain drug costing $2,000 instead of $4,000 isn't going to be a particular relief. I mean, $2,000 or $4,000 is lower than the deductible, so that actually would make a difference. But if someone has a $6,000 deductible and you're able to bring it down, otherwise it doesn't necessarily help. But all of that said, I mean, I think that public manufacture, or a lot more public control of these companies, I think that that's an underrated argument. Is not only does it bring drug prices down, but it brings in, under democratic control or some semblance of it, what drugs get funded, what research gets funded, and now that's completely profit driven. So that's why no one was doing low-level R&D for coronaviruses that didn't exist yet, or coronaviruses that hadn't killed that many people. I mean, no one was going to put that money into it. And instead they're going to allocate money. I mean, like the classic cliche example is like, a cure for male pattern baldness. They'll always be funneling money into, different like.
Are you saying that's not important?
It's, put in some money, sure. But, I like that profit dictated research allocation is a big deal. And that you also have a lot of development along the lines of, they have a super popular drug. And so then they, spend money either doing patent tomfoolery and litigating with other companies, or shallowly changing some drug so that you can, keep your patent for however long. So a lot of those things are, completely inefficient and ultimately keep us from getting the type of R&D and the type of drugs that we would want.
And it's a really, sorry, Ben.
I was just going to say, it's worth contrasting it with where like spheres where we do have public planning. Like, I mean, obviously, I'm a leftist. My least favorite, part of public spending is military spending. But it is also significant if you're just thinking about it structurally that, like when the Pentagon does funding requests, it's about it's premised on like all sorts of fanciful scenarios about things that might or might not happen in the future.
Yeah.
And we don't like that's not how pharmaceutical. Like if you had public pharmaceutical manufacturing, like I think that's the sort of thing that shows you that you could have, hey, here are some scientists say that this is some danger that might be coming down the pike in a few years. We
could all be bald. We could all be bald. That's the next pandemic. No.
I didn't mean to pick on baldness. I'm sorry.
No, I'm just kidding.
No, I would see out here, and here I was just trying to remember the name of the baldness drugs that Homer Simpson takes.
I don't know.
I also think it's the easiest. I mean, it's a really easy argument to make. Like public policy and like a more public system of like how they research like what drugs are going to get funded, because it's public money going into that. So it's like your tax dollars going into what they're choosing to research, and then pharmaceutical companies kind of getting to decide that. I think it's a really easy argument to make, like, like democratizing it. Like your money goes into researching it. Don't you want to have some say in what they research?
Well, yeah. And, obviously like the money the public money that goes into research, like that specific money is earmarked. But, I mean, a company having an R&D budget and they also get federal allocations, obviously, you can only separate those dollars so much. But yeah, I think it would be nice, healthcare ultimately to bring all the conversations together. Healthcare is so obviously a valuable public good, and treating it like one would certainly mean that we should have democratic control over what sort of drugs get researched and what get made, and that should be based on need rather than profit, and that's true for the healthcare system writ large. And we're pretty far from that point now, and we should do whatever we can to get closer to it.
Yeah. I think it also just makes including the pharmaceutical companies in these responses just kind of makes things more complicated, as we're seeing right now. Because then all of a sudden they have to kind of go into like making sure everything's perfect for the pharmaceutical companies, that they're getting like better deals on the pandemic response, like really just making sure that they're comfortable with it. And then, that's time and money that could be spent on actually solving the pandemic.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think that last point about bringing aspects of the health system under collective democratic control is probably the ideal endpoint to the conversation. Thank you for coming on, Natalie.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. This was really fun. Take care.
Thanks. All right, that was Natalie Shure talking about strategy for achieving Medicare for all, and ultimately, more radical horizons, beyond that, like public manufacturing of pharmaceuticals. I should say, by the way, that that I did find it. The baldness drug that Homer Simpson takes is called Demoxenil. That was a really early episode where he takes the Demoxenil, and so he has this like beautiful bushy hair now, and so he's promoted from the factory floor, and he becomes an executive, and his life is going great until the company stops paying for it, and he's once again bald, and they think he's worthless.
Yeah, I vaguely remember that episode.
Fair enough. Let's watch the. So if anybody has any last super chat questions, we'll take those at the very end and plug again the things that are coming up. But right now, let's watch the preview for the episode that is dropping for patrons on Thursday. Just as a reminder, if you want to watch or listen to that whole episode and every other Thursday episode and not wait like a couple months until we unlock it, then go to patreon.com/Ben Burgess and become a patron of Give Them an Argument, as well as the weekly bonus episodes. You also get access to the Discord server. You get monthly Discord office hours group voice chats. You get early access to the monthly Sopranos recap bonus episodes with Big Waz and Mike Racine and Nando Vila. And you also are getting, I think, we're coming up to the point we're gonna have to decide what the second one of these is gonna be. We did the first one last month with Judas and the Black Messiah, but you get monthly Discord movie nights. So lots and lots of treats as gratitude for the solidarity for helping us keep the show going and expand.
Nomadland would be an interesting one to do as the Oscars come up and that gets talked about a lot more.
Yeah. No, that could be good.
I'm putting in my vote early.
All right. Yeah, no, that could be good. Have Jason Miles back on, and yeah, no, that's definitely worth thinking about. All right, let's watch the preview. The British monarchy has been in the news a bit lately because of the Meghan and Harry Oprah interview. And the people at the National Review are very agitated about the thought that people might be having bad thoughts about the monarchy or want to end it. So this is the article, An American Defense of Britain's Constitutional Monarchy, by Joseph LeConte. I'm not quite sure how to say Joseph's last name. But this is in the National Review, and this is not unique to the National Review, by the way. I saw that I think the Heritage Foundation was doing an event about how the British monarchy was, I swear I'm not making this up, a cornerstone of Western democracy.
LeConte is at the Heritage Foundation, I believe.
Oh, okay. All right. So
yeah, he's actually presenters there.
Okay, so LeConte might, as the author of the National Review article, might also have been the organizer of that event. So it might just be basically this one guy who's really worked up about defending the British monarchy.
I think it's absolutely hilarious and comical in so many ways that the National Review, the bastion of all things, classic Americana, 1776, and the great, shining city on the hill, William F. Buckley, are now celebrating the monarchy that the American founders rebelled against. That was also oppressive.
Yeah, well, that is like the like the strangest and funniest thing about this, because if you're going to claim to be all about American patriotism and American values and all of this stuff, then there could be literally nothing more American than hating the British monarchy. That is the origin story of the United States as a country, which actually is something. So I guess started right at the beginning of the article. LeConte says, historians may puzzle for many years over why a rambling, emotional interview between members of the British royal family and an American media tycoon come billionaire became a rallying cry to destroy the British monarchy. Now, as somebody who would very much like to destroy the British monarchy, I don't think there should be monarchies. I wish he was right. I think he's considerably overstating the case about how many people are reacting to it by talking about abolishing the monarchy. Gene, more people in the UK, you might have a different perspective on this.
Yeah, I mean, I would say this: like, there is a growing, I would say, apathetic republicanism in Britain. People aren't super motivated by the abolition of the monarchy. It's not like a cause célèbre. But I think, younger generations are less enthralled by the kind of mystique and magic that the British monarchy represents. And, for my generation who grew up in the 1990s, and I think for even people a little bit older, we grew up with the scandals, the sort of public shaming, the Princess Diana affair, all this stuff. So, the monarchy is very much a kind of tabloid issue for people of my generation. Of course, there are older people, more conservatively oriented people are very attracted to the institution, if not the individuals as part of the monarchy. But I think one thing that's happening more than this interview is the fact that the Queen is aging. The Queen has presided over the British political system since the 1950s. And she's getting old, and we're looking towards a change of guard. Now, the Queen's success, people, even relatively, centrist people who are not usually taken by monarchy, have a kind of affection towards the Queen, largely because she has stayed out of politics. She's been largely quiet. She hasn't been particularly active. But, there has been rumblings about succession, and what's going to happen when, if Prince Charles becomes a king. He's way more outspoken, and so the monarchy is heading towards crisis, and that crisis will come to a head when Queen Elizabeth dies. But I don't think this interview. I think this is a bit of hysteria, and I think there's a kind of underlying, maybe a little bit of bigotry, perhaps.
Well, that's what I was going to ask about. What you guys thought about, because I think that even if their description of other people's motivations is wrong, that it could be revealing that, because you ask, okay, why is it that people who normally are, aroused by the mention of 1776, would be this defensive about the British monarchy, as let me ask about, and the idea that it doesn't seem terribly implausible to me that for reasons you could speculate about, like they might just be irritated by Meghan Markle, speaking ill of the royal family, and so I don't know how much racism is in the backdrop of this or not, but I mean it is hard not to wonder.
I think it's not. I mean, I don't underappreciate the role of racism, but what I think it's more than just about racism. It's about protecting the institutions of the British monarchy and the institutions of Anglo-American empire and liberal democracy and all of that comes along from a burgeoning challenge in the contemporary era, whether you want to attribute it to wokeness or not, where empire, the British Empire, particularly white supremacy, etc., so on and so forth, are being challenged in ways in which the traditional sacrosanct narrative of these nation states, empires, and countries that are used to kind of propagandize towards patriotism are being challenged. And this is not something you only see in Britain. You see this in France right now, where they have, like, they're talking about the Islamo-gauche. They're talking about how there's the invasion of post-colonial studies and critical race theory into France is destabilizing the belief in French universalism, and all of this exists in a larger context, right? Like we cannot forget that Europe and the liberal Western world is in a crisis of a kind of Manichaean battle between reactionary nationalism and the traditional kind of centrist neoliberal order, with the rise of the UKIP, Nigel Farage Brexit situation in England. You have Marine Le Pen in France. You have Front National. You have Golden Dawn. You have all of these kind of reactionary constellations that have been developing really since the early millennium in Europe, and more so particularly after the 2008 crash, compounded with phenomena you have particularly in Great Britain. For example, the Windrush scandal, where you had Caribbean immigrants in Great Britain who had been there for 50 years or so on and so forth, were being deported, and these people were actually British citizens. And also the fact that former British colonies like Barbados are actually trying to say we're done with being part of the British Commonwealth and the British Crown. So I think that what we're realizing, okay, is that there's an existential kind of angst amongst these institutions of empire, as to use the term, the subaltern, if you will, are challenging the moral certitude of their hegemonic control over the Western world.
Yeah. So I mean, I think you can definitely see some of those anxieties here. That like the French case that you pointed out is really funny to me, because as you have Macron and French politicians who were raising the alarms about like the threat of critical theory to French civilization, they're blaming it as being an American import, which is of course exactly the opposite of what American reactionaries say. They blame it as on they call it French import. Yeah, exactly. All right. So again, that episode drops for patrons on Thursday. You can get that full episode, every other episode, by becoming a patron, patreon.com/Ben Burgess, as well as all those other good things that we were talking about earlier. I'm not sure. I think somebody. Well, anyway. The Oscars might be a good reason to do for the next movie night, to do No Bad Land. Somebody else I think was also bringing up in the chat. Well, I think they were talking about the movie Best of Enemies from several years ago, which was about the William F. Buckley Gore Fidel debates, which would definitely be one that would be of interest to people, who'd be potentially watching on that. So we should probably do that one some month. But in any case, want to just run through one more time the stuff that is coming up, and then call it a night. So we have on Wednesday, we're not doing the regular Wednesday movie live stream this week. The next one that's planned is about Paul Verhoeven's satirical science fiction, war movie, Starship Troopers, which we are going to bump that back a week. We're going to do that on the 31st with Danny Bessner and Micah Utrecht and Ryan Lake. And also our graphic designer, J. Andrew World, is going to join us for that. But instead of that, so that'll be on the 31st, but this Wednesday, so 2 days from now, so the 24th, we're going to be doing a special stream with Branko Marketic, the author of Yesterday's Man, the case against Joe Biden. And Branko
I'm excited for that one because I enjoyed. I mean, I didn't get a chance to read the entirety of the book, but like I read the first few chapters and doing research for like segments we've done. So I'm really excited to talk to him about that.
Yeah, for sure. Branko got back to me and he messaged me earlier in the episode and confirmed for that. So we'll be doing our stream on the hole that George W. Bush punched in the Middle East, officially turning 18. So it can go off and fight in America's endless wars in the Middle East.
Hilarious, like not conspiracy theory, but like it's funny that all these articles are coming out about like how George Bush is like, oh, like he's a different kind of Republican. Still, they're pushing that because of Trump. You know what I mean? Like there was a Chris Kaliza thing where he was like, Bush is unrecognizable in today's Republican Party, and he published it in 2021. Which there's no fucking way that you need to keep laundering Bush after Trump has been. You know what I mean? Like kicked out anyway. Not that you did in the first place, but like their argument for that was like Trump is a unique evil, whatever. But it's funny to be like,
look, I mean, Trump is maybe the worst flowering so far of some seeds of evil that have been growing for a long time.
Yeah.
In some ways, right? Not in others, but in some ways. But if you're going to talk, certainly, and whatever. Look, if we could go look in that, Rick and Morty, device that lets you watch TV from alternate dimensions, I'm sure there are tons of them where Trump, some late night tweet storm, caused like a nuclear exchange or something. And so Trump did more damage to the world. But in terms of the actual damage that they did, Bush was much worse. And,
oh, yeah. And there's Chomsky wrote about this a lot, but, Bush basically going to the UN and saying like, fuck you, we don't need you, which the UN is not a very good safeguard for world peace. It's not a very safeguard in terms of equity, but even those standards, Bush kind of completely destroyed, because I don't play it very much, or I don't really believe like, global standing as like a concept, because obviously we're the worst imperialist country in the history of the world since at least those giant empires, in like the, centuries ago, but I think that does do lasting damage to the point where it places us where we are today. Like it's like a continued flouting of global standards and the global conversation continually from Bush till now. You know what I mean? Like
no, exactly. And look, also if we're going to talk about all the damage that Bush did, I mean the obvious things are the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, the beginning of the drone program, the Patriot Act, and setting up the global network of off the books prisons where you could torture people.
Yeah,
but and lots of maybe less blood curdlingly exciting stuff. That did all kinds of damage, domestically, and in terms of things like his war on teachers unions and other stuff, but
continually cutting down the social safety net, as all Republican presidents would do. But
yeah, no, for sure. But also, if we're going to talk about the damage that George W. Bush did to the world, part of that damage is creating the conditions in which Donald Trump could be president. I don't think that you get Trump without Bush, because if without Bush responding to 9/11, by elevating this, what should have been a criminal matter, to this like pseudo Cold War kind of global military, thing that was framed as a clash of civilizations, and all the fear mongering that went along with it, I don't think you would get somebody like Trump, who's a huge part of what he was running on in 2016 was fear mongering about Muslims. Fear
mongering about Muslims while managing to criticize endless war, which is honestly kind of an impressive tightrope walk.
It is.
Like Muslims are coming for you. Muslims are coming for you. We're all gonna die. But going to war with majority Muslim countries, bad idea. And it's like,
Yeah.
but like I just think
so Trump was able to both exploit the fear that Bush had built up and at least pretend to be against some of the worst things that Bush did. So in multiple ways, without Bush, you probably couldn't have had Trump. All of which is just to say that, I mean, like if you had, I mean, look, I'm willing to entertain the idea that there might be other presidents, who did even worse in the long term. I think you could make a case for Rutherford B. Hayes or whatever, but like, within the last 100 years, my God, it's just no contest. It's George W. Bush.
Yeah. Well, and I also think that the biggest difference between Bush and Trump isn't policy. The biggest difference is the unraveling of the idea that the Republican Party, like they're despots, they're like whatever, but they're civil about it. You know what I mean? Like that's the unraveling of that civil politics. I think is the biggest difference between Bush and Trump. Trump could say whatever the fuck he wanted because the Republican Party realized, in 2016, like nobody gives a fuck. Like even Bush had to pretend like, oh, like, I'm not racist. I'm not an offensive guy. I'm a regular guy. I just believe in these these compassionate conservative policies, which are not compassionate ever. But you know what I mean? Like at least he was pretending that. The big difference is that the Republican Party realized they could stop pretending that. They could stop pretending to be compassionate in any fucking way, shape, or form. But it's funny that for somebody like Chris Cillizza at CNN, where politics are all aesthetic, like then it is kind of like, oh well, Bush is unrecognizable in this Republican Party because the only thing he's paying attention to are those civility politics. So I don't know. I just thought that was a funny article. Oh, you're muted. Hold on.
Yeah, no, that's for sure. I mean, like I think that. I mean, certainly all of the Never Trump Republicans and quite a few of the kind of liberals, who look back fondly on George W. Bush, like what they object to most about Trump isn't what he did. It's that he was uncouth while he did it, So
yeah.
I mean, obviously, fuck that. But in any case. This lots of good stuff coming up that we've already mentioned. Do want to just say again for the next regular episode next Monday, I'm going to be talking to RJ Esco, who people might remember from we watched in the Sunday Night Debate Live breakdown series. We watched his debate with Matt Taibbi about Herbert Marcuse. So since Esco's into the philosophy stuff, we're going to be talking about this book, Why Not Socialism, by G.A. Cohen. And then Nando will be on in the second half, which is always a blast. Looking forward to all of that. Thank you to everybody who stuck with us for this tonight, for the 3 hours or so of this.
Yeah, so much for not doing a 3-hour episode.
I know, right? We were talking about ended earlier tonight. But much appreciated. Love you guys. By far the best audience in left media. It's always a pleasure. We'll still see people back here on Wednesday for the Iraq War turns 18 live stream. Left is best.